He was an ordinary schoolboy whose life flowed steadily, without any adventures or twists and turns, lazily and slowly. But if you were born into an average family, you go to an average school. Gray, everyday life without worries or fuss, normal grades, ordinary friends, a quiet way home where there are no bullies waiting for you around the corner. Nothing special. That could be his motto in life, where he already saw his gray, unremarkable old age and death in his dreams. Therefore, our hero selflessly subjected himself to voluntary withdrawal from reality. Only in games could his youthful blood find an outlet. But everything changed when he was lucky enough to play the role of a hero, because there he became a master of the game and lived a whole life filled with meaning. Meanwhile, he hurried home, and the long summer sun painted the sky red velvet, as if welcoming him. School suffocated him with its swampy routine, killing all joy of existence, so only at home did he feel free and rush to tear off the tie that was choking his neck. Ignoring dinner, his fingers reached for the coveted button behind which whole worlds were hidden. Some might consider such a life pathetic, but our guy saw nothing wrong with it. After all, only in single-player games can you feel like a king. Here, you can always save your progress, start over, and change the difficulty. You can use tricks, legal and not so legal, to remove all restrictions and become the strongest. The whole world exists for the sake of one player. Isn't that wonderful? So he spent his days enjoying and exploring the world of fantasy games. Along the way, he shared his impressions on streaming services. Sometimes, other enthusiastic slackers would drop by and quickly figure out that he was a schoolboy, because the broadcast usually started in the evening, when high school students finished classes. But some people enjoyed watching this guy and his gaming adventures, so sometimes he received their gratitude and generous donations. However, today, their generosity was like that of a patron of the arts. In the eyes of an ordinary schoolboy, the $1,000 that appeared in his account felt exactly like that. To be honest, he had never seen such money in his life, so he stared at the monitor, not believing his eyes. A few of his fans immediately got excited about this turn of events and started joking with the streamer. But the mysterious and immensely generous donor asked to read the letter. With 2 clicks, the guy looked into his email inbox. The user with the nickname Dia, which indirectly referred to God and reminded him of creation, was an indie game developer. One of his games, which took him more than 7 days to develop, turned out to be too difficult, so no one passed its beta test. At that moment, something stirred inside the guy as he read the words. It was the very adventure that had fallen into his lap, giving him a chance to escape his dull, ordinary life. Of course, he immediately installed the game, anticipating how he would accomplish a gaming feat, even if no one would know about it, because Dio asked him not to publish his walkthrough. Thus began his acquaintance with the game Fate of the Hero. The game started with a familiar story. Once peaceful kingdoms entered a turbulent age, and a pitiful soul was destined to become a hero and bring down the hammer of justice on enemies and an evil god. The graphics were clearly weak, noted the young gamer. On the other hand, Deo did everything on his own, so it could be called an excellent performance. At the start, he was asked to come up with a name for his character. It didn't matter, so the guy modestly signed with his streamer nickname, Master of the Game, and before him lay a wide lake, or perhaps a bay, with a surface as smooth as a mirror, backed by jagged mountains. The picture changed abruptly, and the character found himself in the middle of a forest, like all other newcomers. Nothing else happened, no training or silly hints, just press forward to move and jump with the spacebar. A gray-haired old man with deep wrinkles on his face came out to meet the stranger. He introduced himself as the village elder and asked the traveler why he was there. Surprisingly, the game did not provide any answer options. The player had to enter it himself. This was both alarming and intriguing at the same time. But our hero was very resourceful and loved to experiment, so he quickly came up with an answer. "Give me all the village's gold," his character said, threatening to kill all the inhabitants. Osir waited tensely, not particularly hoping that the game would be able to support such a complex role-playing part, especially since it was an indie project created by one person. However, at that very moment, the old man struck the arrogant hero directly on the temple with his staff. "Your eyelids are getting heavy," the gamer read his status. "You died. Cause of death: skull fracture." A cry of surprise and delight escaped from his mouth. "What the hell is going on here?" the gamer shouted. To die after the first random line, and from some old man, he didn't even know what surprised him more. The game offered to try again, and of course he agreed. What nonsense. Who would give up the game after the first attempt? Why were they wasting his time with such a meaningless question? He spoke to the elder again, but this time he pretended to be a tired and hungry traveler asking for help and compassion. The mayor told him to follow him and slowly headed toward the village. He led him into his house, which was full of furniture and well finished, even though it was built entirely of wood and not stone. The old man handed him a cup and said that was all he could give him, after which the traveler would have to leave. The gambler accepted the gift without hesitation. "Your eyelids are getting heavy. You have been poisoned with a toxic potion." His status was updated. This game definitely did not play around with its participants but immediately threw them into a cruel reality, albeit a fictional one. In ancient times, strangers were treated with suspicion. A foreigner would be considered more of a demon than a guest, and, just in case, sent to the other world. Without thinking twice, the guy pulled out the internet connection cord with a malicious grin. Without a connection, he figured, the characters' electronic brains would be inaccessible and they wouldn't be able to do anything. This time, instead of answering, he simply drummed on the keyboard, and again he was killed. The villagers tore out the tongue of the demon, who was carrying something unknown, but surely wanted to convert God's servants and lead them astray from the true path. Even with the internet turned off, the game continued to run smoothly, which was discouraging. Then Osir began to wonder. The only thing connecting him to the mysterious developer Deo was a letter, and no one even knew who he was. Distracted for a second, he saw that it was already past midnight, and after clicking save, he went to bed. If someone had told him then that the world of Hero's Destiny existed, that he wasn't just chatting with characters for no reason, he would never have believed it. But that explains why no one even passed the beta test, and it was so exciting that the guy couldn't sleep for a long time. From that day on, he put his heart and soul into becoming special and immersed himself in this mysterious and complex world, where even the tutorial prologue is deadly dangerous and the rules are nowhere written. And so 10 years passed in the blink of an eye. The school routine was replaced by the office routine, and he lived like a zombie when someone's soft voice called his name. "Osiro-san," she called, adding a respectful suffix to his name, although anyone would have forgiven her for the usual form of address. So charming was this girl who informed him about the documents that had been sent. The once quiet schoolboy had become a grown man, but he hadn't changed his glasses. Of course, he understood that she had lingered on his face after such a trivial message for a reason. It was late. The other employees had long since left, but it wasn't the kind of time when you wanted to hurry home and fall face down on your pillow. So Osiru's gaze did not hide the curves of her body in the dim light of the monitors. Their work was done for the day. Formal communication with people, polite and restrained, was Osiru's secret to a successful life as an office worker. But now the girl next to him was clearly about to break this habit, and she held her breath, as if deciding to take the plunge. "Maybe we could have dinner at my place," she asked, her speech slightly quickened by excitement and adding even softer notes to her voice. Suzuhara herself understood how desperate this step was, but even though she was embarrassed, she did not look away with her brown eyes, and looked at him intently, waiting for an answer. Formal speech, polite tone, no unnecessary emotions. Osiro understood everything, but pretended not to understand anything in order to avoid unnecessary awkwardness at work. So he simply refused. For a moment, in the dim flicker of the monitor, it seemed to him that her beautiful model-like face had turned deathly pale, although before that, it had been covered with a blush. The girl had not expected such a response. Seeing this change, Osiru politely explained that today was an important day for him, and suggested they meet another time. She had hoped to cut through the knot of unspoken words and doubts, but the guy who always sat next to her, lost in his own thoughts, deftly dodged it. He dodged again, and the beautiful lady sighed with annoyance. No matter how she hinted at things, he still wriggled away like an eel. The evening was filled with a pleasant coolness that tickled his heated insides, and even after 10 years, he hurried home to his adventure. Today was a special day, the day he had been working toward all this time, the day he would finish the hero's destiny. Or rather, the night, because Osir sat at the monitor without closing his eyes, which now burned with hellfire as if someone had poured sand into them. No epic intro screens or videos, just a short message saying that he was the first person to complete the game and enter the Hall of Fame. That was the end. He could relax and stretch his arms. The hero's journey had been dangerous and thorny, and all the walls bore traces of his research and trials. "Finally, I did it!" Osir shouted triumphantly, rejoicing like a little boy. He had devoted 10 years of his life to this, and had no regrets. Even though he had started playing to become special, nothing else in his life had changed, and it continued to flow lazily like the waters of the estuary. The world of destiny of the hero was his second life, which he lived there. So now the guy was overcome with emptiness and nostalgia. Images of characters floated before his eyes. Gale the Impassive, Krakow, the Black Prince, the harsh Cardinal Cesare Ravallo, the most beautiful of witches, Celestina Yulin, each with their own charming and fascinating story, and their reactions were so vivid that at times they were indistinguishable from real people. Osir leaned his shoulders against the back of the chair and rubbed his eyes, which had not known rest for so many years, and miraculously had not worn out from staring at the monitor at work and at home. But then he received a notification, or rather an offer to experience another adventure. This time there was a strange note. If he agreed, he would be immediately transported to the continent of Arena, and he would not be able to return until he had completed it. Could it be a hidden scenario, Osir thought? But fate was allowing him to experience this excitement and thrill again. So how could he refuse? And in the next second, the world faded before his eyes. A moment later, Osiro felt a burning sensation in his chest, as if someone had poured molten lead into it. A second ago, he had been in his room. Now, a mustachioed man as big as a bear was leaning over him, and with a voice as deep as a bear's, he said he was glad the potion had worked. His green eyes stared ahead in bewilderment, searching for something to hold on to, but his mind was still drowning in a sea of unknown things. "Mr. Callias?" The man addressed him, a man of age whose short, mop-like mustache was already touched with gray. "Sir?" The address sounded strange to his ears. No one had ever addressed him that way before, and now he lay pale and weak, as if he had just been struck by a fever. It was obvious that the man in the red doublet was his servant, otherwise he would not have called him sir. But now he frowned angrily after Osir inadvertently asked him who he was, not yet fully recovered from the move. It was no surprise that his brain was in turmoil, as if recovering from anesthesia, and questions swarmed in his head. "You really don't remember?" asked the servant, pain evident in his voice. He bowed politely as etiquette demanded and introduced himself as Russell, as if they were indeed meeting for the first time. It was obvious that he was not in Japan and was not speaking Japanese, yet the language sounded familiar and understandable. But what bothered him most was the crucible of molten lead that twisted his insides into a knot with its weight and heat. The pain made the guy roll over onto his side, and Russell became alarmed. This man blamed himself and his haste for what had happened, and his voice was filled with sincere remorse and pain. He asked him not to worry, saying that the pain was just a side effect of the potion and would soon pass, to which the pale guy in bed only moaned weakly in response. Not wanting to tire the gentleman any longer with his presence, Russell promised to visit him tomorrow morning and bowed politely again. The boy felt as weak as a wax candle quickly melting in a candlestick on the dresser, just as quickly as his strength was rapidly leaving his body, clouding his mind. Despite the burning pain, confusion, and wild terror of a creature that seemed to be in the middle of a storm at sea with no means of rescue, he still managed to fall asleep that night. In the morning, everything that had happened no longer seemed like a dream after a coma. From the surface of a large and undoubtedly very expensive mirror, a thin, sickly teenager with light hair looked back at him, wearing a loose-fitting shirt and pants that hung on him like thin sticks. His face was handsome despite its grayish hue, with noble features and rare eyes the color of marsh mud. But who was he? Osir wondered with surprise, looking at the teenager's face in the mirror. Still just a boy who hadn't even grown a mustache yet, when just recently he had felt perfectly fine in the body of a healthy adult man. There were no memories of this in his head. Only his own memories of 30 years lived in another world, and he couldn't even remember the boy's name. Who was he? This question gnawed at his mind, and Osir nervously ran his fingernails across the glass, examining himself as if his appearance could provide some kind of answer. At that moment, a virtual screen appeared before his eyes, an indispensable tool for anyone who had ended up in another world. The screen displayed an impressive list of details about this character. His name was Callias Shaken, a young count of 15 years of age. The pain in his chest was the result of a stab wound he had suffered, a pitiful power, a bad reputation, and a complete lack of any talent for management or diplomacy. It also became immediately clear that this was indeed the world of the hero's destiny, which meant he was on the continent of Erin. Who would have thought that he would really be thrown into another world? Osir clenched his teeth in anger. Could he have imagined that one click of the mouse could change everything so much? What were the reasons for this? Who in their right mind would come up with such an opaque notification? But it was too late to lament. Before his eyes flashed the map of the world that he had studied so long and so carefully. Osir, or more correctly, Callias, took a deep breath to calm himself. He carefully touched his chest to check, because even the status mentioned a stab wound. However, the burning pain, as if the tip was still sticking out of the wound, made him curl up and fall to the floor. Along with the pain came the disturbing realization that he was trapped in this body and this world. And until the adventure was over, he would have to live another life. The life of Kalias Shakina. What a strange name they had given him. But he would have to get used to that too, he thought, and with great difficulty crawled to the bed. Pain spread throughout his body like needles, rewarding him with unbearable torment for all his efforts. As soon as Kalias thought about his status, it appeared before his eyes. He hoped that no one else would see it, otherwise he would be burned at the stake as a sorcerer, just in case, because these were dark times and people were superstitious. And yet it was an adventure, more real than anything he had experienced before. So the guy, who now felt like a boy again rather than a grown-up office plankton, was excited about this new life. From past experience, he knew that if he wasn't careful, he could easily die. Opening several system screens in front of him, he began to study himself. Being reborn as a count's son was like winning the lottery, certainly better than being a serf or a goat herd, which was the fate of 9 out of 10 people. There was a knock at the door, and Kalias flinched. He had not yet decided how and with whom he should behave, but life was already throwing him into the arms of fate. He still remembered how he had died the first time he entered the game. First, he had to calm down. If anyone found out that he wasn't the real owner of this body and its destiny, it would be the end of him. He was Kalias Shaken, son of Count Colin. He repeated this to himself over and over, as if reciting a spell which made him even more nervous. After calming down a little, he answered the knock in a weak voice, asking who was there. "It's time for your medication, sir," replied a soft female voice, which he could tell had been deliberately lowered to sound even softer. It must be the maid, thought Kalias. Being addressed as sir still grated on his ears, another thing he would have to get used to. He told her to come in, keeping his voice as firm as he could, and she immediately entered, her long dress swaying, barely revealing her ankles. Kalias' green eyes widened. The girl was young and beautiful. She knelt before him, holding out a cup with some kind of potion. She's pretty, the guy thought. In his past life, he hadn't been particularly interested in the opposite sex, but the lush breasts, tightened by a thick corset, occupied his entire consciousness at that moment. Forgetting himself, Kalias almost asked her who she was, and immediately bit his tongue, as if to admit that he was no longer Kalias. Just think, he almost failed at the very first word. He was horrified. The maid saw his anxiety and asked excitedly what was wrong, staring at him with her large, light brown eyes. "Nothing," the young man replied briefly and called up the status window, hoping that nothing terrible would happen. Right before his eyes appeared the same list of character traits as his own. Her name was Lyra, a 23-year-old commoner with a cold-blooded, selfish streak. In the combat power section, she was listed as 3rd class, and her military skills were at level E. This was quite impressive for a maid and a girl, because she was much stronger than her master. Kalias studied her case carefully. Then he noticed that she belonged to Viscount Kosherin, which meant that she did not serve his family at all. And suddenly the young man realized this and became wary. Combined with her 3rd-class power, which by earthly standards corresponded to the level of special forces, even without using mana, this girl was dangerous. Kalias was amazed as to why a person with such power, a bad reputation, and allegiance to another lord would serve as an ordinary maid. The heir to the Shaken County was wounded, and he was being nursed by a maid from another family. And since she was the one who brought the medicine, it was definitely not to be drunk, thought the young count. And he involuntarily pursed his lips, as if the potion would be poured into him by force. Seeing that he was in no hurry to take the cup, the maid hurried him, and her voice rang with a metallic tone. In a weak and uncertain voice, he ordered her to put the cup on the table. "Drink it," she demanded shrilly, and a forced smile appeared on her face, as if to cheer him up, but capable of deceiving only a 3-year-old child. The count became angry, and the persistent woman did not leave him alone, even though they were her masters. But he had no intention of drinking this swill. So, pretending that his wound had started to hurt again, he suddenly dropped the potion on the floor. A single moment separated the strange concoction from staining the plowed field and the Persian apricot carpet with its smell, which would then have to be thrown away. It was not a great sacrifice if his own life was at stake, but that moment was enough for Lyra's hand to fly up with the reflexes of a mongoose. She caught the bowl without spilling a drop. The mask of sweetness and ostentatious charm disappeared from her face, and she looked at him with the gaze of a killer. Kalias gasped in surprise. He hadn't expected such a trick. Her superb skills had ruined his plan, and there was no time to come up with a new one. Lyra placed the tray on the table, and the Count stalled for time as best he could, since even the slightest movement caused a wave of pain in his chest. "It's good that we managed to save the medicine," said Lyra, her voice soft again, apparently having regained her composure. Bad thoughts crept into his head. Who knows what was going on in this girl's mind? Even if he had been completely healthy, he would not have been able to fight her off. There was definitely poison in the cup, and it was impossible to drink it. The Count decided he needed to distract the maid from the bowl somehow, so he pretended to fall to the floor as if overcome by pain and weakness. However, he was instantly picked up by strong and gentle female hands. Despite her cold and calculating nature, Lyra was warm and smelled pleasantly of chamomile and sage. She gently sat him down on the bed, and once again, it was not easy to get rid of the maid. Her combat skills helped her in this. Leaning on Lyra's shoulder, Callias began to think intently and study the available lists of information. Callias was the son of the Count's first wife, but she had died long ago, and then Count Shaken married a second time. The second wife's maiden name, as Kosherin discovered, was also Kosherin, and she also bore the Count a son. Now the puzzle was coming together. Lyra served the Count's second wife, and his stepmother sent her maid to eliminate her and make the position of heir vacant again. This was common in the Middle Ages, when people died like flies. The beautiful commoner next to him was a trained and skilled killer. Even if he didn't drink the poison, she would finish him off with her bare hands. His stepbrother would become the next Count. It was all very simple and straightforward. People are willing to do anything for power, especially if the risk of punishment is not great. A fratricidal struggle, isn't that wonderful? Thought Callias, and smiled slightly. From the very beginning, the game threw him into a crazy whirlwind of events and promised to be interesting. Then he gently moved away from the maid, whose face was covered by an ominous shadow. And in passing, he asked her how his stepmother was doing. This question caught Lyra off guard, like an unexpected dagger thrust, and she flinched. The Countess was very saddened by the heir's attempt to take his own life and asked him never to do so again. The maid replied politely. Was the previous owner of this body really a suicide? Callias wondered. Judging by the location of the wound and the information from the status window, it looked more like someone had tried to stab the boy. Callias promised not to bother the Countess with such matters again, and Lyra promised just as formally and distantly to pass on his words. She remained impassive, waiting to see what he would do next. The Count attacked again and suggested that he relay these words right away. "Unfortunately, you have not yet taken your medicine," she said, her words ringing like a coin, making it clear that she would not leave until the potion was drunk, even if she had to force it down his throat. And from her merciless gaze, the boy understood that this was no joke. Until then, he had felt confident, but now he felt a deathly chill down his spine. They were both cornering each other, but Callias didn't know how far this servant was willing to go. She stubbornly stuck to her principles, completely disregarding her master's will. He knew for sure that he was facing a killer, so he couldn't politely ask her to leave. Otherwise, the dagger or silk cord would simply do the job of the potion. And what could a 30-year-old man from a more humane era, trapped in the body of a frail teenage boy with a weak soul, do? Callias was horrified. Would a loud cry help? Most likely, it would be cut off faster than he could exhale. Lyra slowly returned to the table where she had left the zeal, while Callias nervously went over all the options for his imminent demise. Only now he had no restart button. Lyra simply left him no choice but to drink this swill. But then it dawned on him. It would have been easier to kill him with a knife, but the conspirators still wanted to use poison, apparently so as not to attract attention and fall into disgrace. Most likely the poison in the cup was difficult to detect, which meant that his death would be attributed to the consequences of a failed suicide attempt, which would already be considered successful. Slow death was the name of this poison. If he had trouble drinking the medicine, she could help him, Lyra added coldly. And Callias had no doubt about that. When he first started playing the game of a hero's destiny, he immediately realized one immutable truth. Always expect the worst. If you want to live, don't let go of your doubts, and always be on your guard. Callias smiled. He had only just arrived in this world, and already he had been cornered like a hunted animal, which made his blood boil with excitement. Lyra patiently held the bowl as if she had turned into a statue. Realizing there was no other way out, he took the potion and downed it in one gulp, trying not to touch it with his tongue so as not to taste the earth and mold. The maid kept her eyes on him until the cup was empty. "You have been poisoned with a slow-acting poison," he immediately read in the status. Now every second counted. He had to find a way out of this situation. If he had been a real count, he would not even have suspected that he had been poisoned and would most likely have died. But now Callias had a chance of salvation, And then he remembered Russell's words about the precious potion that saved his life after he was wounded. A ray of hope shone on the gloomy horizon of his prospects. In a weak voice, the Count ordered the maid to call his personal servant, but instead of obeying, she asked why he needed him. This angered Callias, and he frowned, wondering why he should have to answer to a maid. Now it was Lyra who shuddered at the change in him, as if she had been whipped across the back, and she humbly apologized. The task was complete, so she needed to leave quickly anyway. The young Count's voice broke into a shout as he ordered her to carry out his orders quickly. After all, his life was at stake. The high-quality potion that Russell had used was worth as much as a small castle on the border of the kingdom. There was no doubt about Russell's kindness, since he had been so generous. At least he was unlikely to pose a threat to him now, thought Callias. After waiting for the maid to leave, he got out of bed. The first thing he did was grab the pot from the dresser and empty the contents of his stomach into it, almost turning himself inside out from the disgusting taste in his mouth. Once inside his intestines, Lyra's concoction did not become any more pleasant. Of course, the poison had already entered his bloodstream, so this only helped to buy a little time, and he urgently needed to find the potion. Callias nervously searched the room, wondering where the precious vial could be. He had no doubt that it was kept in this room, ready to be used if necessary. But then he read the inscription on the status and cursed, "Your eyelids are getting heavy." He turned the dresser upside down, mercilessly scattering everything around. Along with the status, a wave of weakness really did wash over him, and the young Count fell onto the expensive handmade Persian carpet. If he died like this, would he have a second chance? Or was this really the end of his life? That's what he was thinking about as his consciousness slowly faded. And then one object caught his eye. It looked like an ordinary milk jug, the kind used to add milk to tea. For a second, he thought he would never wake up again. But his eyes opened again, and he saw what he thought was medicine in front of him. All he had to do was crawl a little and reach out his hand. Callias took it and sniffed its contents. It smelled as if life had sprung up inside it, and it reeked of sour milk. The guy almost threw up again from the foul smell. Spoiled goat milk confirmed the system, displaying the object's properties. Regular yogurt was an excellent antidote to slow death, Callias recalled. Could spoiled milk be considered yogurt? Someone must have put the milk here and forgotten to take it away. The status of dying reminded him again. There was no time left for reflection. This was already the third warning. Callias swore to take revenge for this and, holding his nose, poured another portion of the nasty stuff into himself. "Awake, my lord," asked the tall man with the bear-like stature and bear-like voice, who still had a thick brush of hair on his face instead of a mustache. Seeing him, Callias experienced a feeling of déjà vu. Could he have returned to the starting point? The young Count muttered thoughtfully. "What are you talking about?" Russell asked sternly, as fathers ask their children when they have done something wrong. "For the mess you've made," the servant scolded him, pointing to the papers scattered everywhere. "And for lying on the floor," Russell growled angrily. The boy turned away as if in pain, glad to be alive. The butler was very worried about him because he had been unconscious for a long time, and it was already time to call a doctor. Callias would not want to experience anything like this again for anything in the world. The feeling was like a noose tightening around his neck. His green eyes, still cloudy with weakness, were full of determination that no matter what happened, he would survive. Lyra would surely not lag behind him and would return to finish what she had started. So he decided to first check on Russell, who was even more angry that the prince had not responded to him. His name was Russell Kneisel, and he held the title of Viscount, served as the acting Earl of Shaken, and possessed impressive combat prowess despite his advanced age, having reached his 60s. The fact that the Viscount was acting as Count and managing everything meant that the old Count had died without appointing an heir. Since Russell was an old soldier and had already saved him once by paying a fortune, he could be trusted. The young Count addressed Russell by name, but immediately corrected himself, now addressing Aaron's representative. The Viscount nodded, listening attentively. Callias told him everything about Lyra and the conspiracy of the Count's second wife. But the Viscount replied regretfully that there was insufficient evidence for a serious accusation. And then the young man realized that even though Russell had used such a valuable potion, he had no particular feelings for the heir, but was simply following the family charter. This man was a servant to the core, but his loyalty was dictated by duty, not personal devotion and sympathy. Callias indignantly asked whether he should continue to take the remedies sent by those who wanted to take his place. "It seems he really has lost his memories," Russell noted sadly. The family budget was limited, so Lyra was now doing a lot of the errands. And so they could not disturb her with unfounded suspicions, the Viscount declared. Callias clenched his fists. There was no other choice but to obtain evidence. Lyra surely thought he was already dead, and so he decided to leave the subject for the time being. Then, with a devilish grin, the young count said he had a small request, and it wasn't difficult at all. Russell frowned. The heir was indeed behaving unusually. 4 hours later, a figure in a cloak, with the agility and strength of a cat, landed on the roof of Count Shaken's castle in a few leaps. A black cloak with 2 steel shoulder pads completely concealed the figure of the night traveler. In a dark corner, he waited patiently for the guards to leave for their shift change. When the night visitor peeked out from behind the corner, the moonlight revealed a pretty face covered by a mask and brown eyes. Anyone seeing them would easily recognize the young count's maid. Despite the fact that the castle's security had been reinforced, she easily made her way inside, and she was surprised to find that there was no one in the heir's chambers. Lyra entered quietly, opening the doors without a squeak, as befits a professional assassin. The count lay in bed, lifeless, as he should have been. At least he died without pain, she thought, comforting her weak conscience. Imagine, even assassins have a conscience, and it often bothers them like a stone in their shoe. Lyra took the letter out of her pocket and laid it on the table, then rummaged through the drawer. Taking out the count's seal, she left an impression on the letter she had written earlier. Everything was ready. All that remained was to complete the task, Lyra thought. But before she could move, a razor-sharp blade tickled her throat, promising a chilling, deadly kiss. "Don't move," growled a man in a bear-like voice, who had somehow managed to sneak up on her unnoticed. "It's too late anyway," Lyra hissed maliciously. "The heir to Callias is dead, and now Shaken Castle and all its possessions belong to Granbane," she hissed, glancing toward the young count's bed. But the old Viscount remained silent. Taking this as a sign of hesitation, Lyra continued her attack, asking whether the Viscount should not be looking after the affairs of the county, rather than serving a sickly prince who was already dead. "And yet he is clever," the young count praised himself. Which is why the poisoner maid lost her gift of speech. Poison is a common remedy where there is not enough courage to take justice into one's own hands. The count continued slowly, clearly enjoying the effect he had produced. He took the paper left by the maid from the table and read its contents. "There will be a lot of noise when the world learns of their misdeeds." Realizing that she had been cornered, and that nothing good awaited her at the end of this road except a tight noose and thick hemp thread, Lyra grabbed her daggers and abruptly broke free from the bear's grip. But despite his age, Russell had lost none of his speed, and lightning fast grabbed her slender wrist, cracking her knuckles. The bear's paw twisted her arm so that the poisoner screamed in pain. Then his huge anvil-like fist caressed her ribs with a battering blow. Their fighting power differed by an order of magnitude, so the outcome was expected. But Callias was still surprised when he saw it with his own eyes. Russell was definitely not the kind of person to joke with. His mere presence was intimidating. "Poisoning is common practice," Callias said when Lyra became an attentive listener again. "And only a fool would leave behind material evidence and a witness," he reasoned. "Anyone who dared to raise a hand against a nobleman would be executed under torture. But even a nobleman could be hanged." Lyra barely suppressed a groan from the pain in her shoulder, but said nothing. "The evidence is right here," said the young count, looking again at the sheet of paper with the family seal. "And the witness?" he added, pointing his finger right at her face, no longer afraid of a snake without fangs. As if finally realizing her fate, Lyra's legs gave way beneath her. She fell lifeless to the floor, greatly puzzling the young count. Surprisingly, even with her combat training, her composure evaporated, and her mind cowardly escaped into oblivion. Russell touched her back, and a bright blue light began to emanate from it, illuminating the room like a lantern. Callias was surprised to realize that it was a mana core. And now Russell knew that Lyra was not just a simple servant. However, the old warrior quickly realized that the poisoner did not know how to use mana breath. Apart from her physical abilities, Lyra had no other weapons, which meant that mana restriction could not be used on her. Usually, circulation blocking was used on particularly dangerous criminals. Callias watched the old warrior's expression closely. He did not seem particularly surprised, so perhaps he knew about Lyra's combat skills. Russell himself was suspicious of the boy who had changed so much. The young count ordered the poisoner to be tied up. It was time to hear the song of the captured bird. The Viscount tied her firmly to a chair, showing no mercy for the delicate skin on her wrists and ankles. Her right hand was swollen and purple like the sunset, bruised from Russell's strong grip. Callias poured a few drops of healing potion directly onto the injury, and gently, tenderly, he wiped the cold sweat from her face. And then the poisoner, who had been in glorious oblivion until then, woke up again to find herself in a living nightmare. Callias hastened to remind her of the effect of the poison that the maid had forced him to take. He stopped breathing after a couple of minutes. The perfect poison for suicide. the poisoned person feels nothing. Without a doubt, anyone would believe that the pitiful young count had decided to finish what he could not do with a sword. With a sharp movement, Callias threw away the stained handkerchief. They use a poison on her that acts quickly, the count told her, as if mocking her, saying that if she was ready to die with him, she would not lose. So why? He asked, squeezing her beautiful face painfully with his cold, thin fingers. Lyra stared at him in bewilderment, not understanding where he was going with this. He was overcome with anger. The former Callias did not want to die, and now he was enraged by this blind devotion to the countess who had ordered Lyra to become a poisoner. Despite her dire situation, the girl's gaze did not dim, and she still looked back at him proudly. The young count ordered Russell to open the girl's mouth. A bear-like grip squeezed her jaws so that they opened involuntarily. And then she saw in his hand the ominous ball that the count had prudently kept in his handkerchief. He threw it into the poisoner's open mouth, offering her a taste of her own medicine. And instead of water, he gave her the remains of rotten goat's milk to drink. "She must swallow," said the young count ruthlessly. And the old bear replied, "Yes," clamping her fragile mouth shut and pinching her nostrils. The Viscount forced Lyra to swallow everything. The foul smell and taste nearly made her lose consciousness again, causing the hapless murderer to cough. What kind of filth did they give her? The proud maid asked indignantly. She would have preferred to be hanged. "Poison," Callias repeated briefly, closing the milk jug. "And what kind of poison?" Lyra asked him again, frowning like a wild cat. "Sidiza's puppet," the young count said ominously, and before the girl's eyes appeared a skeletal figure with puppeteer's strings coming out of its hands. "Impossible," the girl blurted out. "That a frail and useless child could receive something like that. As long as your pockets are heavy with gold, you can get anything," Callias remarked with a smirk. And for greater persuasiveness, he named the secret ingredient of this sinister remedy, white radish. And Lyra felt a tight knot inside. The morning sun shone through the count's bedroom window and illuminated his face, completely indifferent to human life and suffering. Lyra began to deny everything, for the change in the count was too abrupt. A heartless smirk spread across Callias's face. To survive, he had to follow the rules of this world. He was already convinced that he would not be exposed if he carefully immersed himself in his role. Putting on this mask, he felt as if it had always been with him. Then Callias said he would let her go and told her to inform her mistress that the murder had been successful. But why would she do that? Lyra asked reasonably, since she would face trial and execution under torture anyway. And then the count gave her a glimmer of hope, a slim chance that her existence would continue. Lyra bit her lip, already feeling the strange effects of the liquid that had been poured into her. And the count only reinforced her suspicions by saying that there were thousands of ingredients in the marionette Cinza, and that preparing an antidote was a complicated matter. "And for her, the perfect antidote is this," added Callias, pointing to his light-colored head. Lyra curled up painfully in her chair, as much as her tight bonds would allow. "Stubbornness will get you nowhere," said the count insinuatingly, "so she must obey him." And Lyra felt as if an ocean octopus had settled inside her and was frantically lashing about with its long tentacles. The poisoned poisoner breathed heavily and intermittently, while the count urged her to answer. "Heal me quickly!" Lyra suddenly cried out, pierced by sharp pain and anxiety that it could lead to the worst. "What's all the fuss about?" "He was already trying to help her," replied the count haughtily and lazily. Lyra curled up as best she could, already feeling the inexorable approach of a disgrace worse than death or failure. Even Russell was alarmed that the proud servant had suddenly become pliable and weak-willed, like melted wax. Her voice plaintively begged for help, suddenly completely devoid of its cold and proud notes, as if she had turned into a pathetic little girl. Spoiled goat's milk works flawlessly, the count realized, and with great difficulty maintained a serious, detached expression, so as not to burst out laughing. He calmly asked Russell to untie the captive, as she was hardly dangerous now. The Viscount asked anxiously if everything would be all right, since it had been less than 2 hours since the girl had tried to kill him. "They should protect the dignity of an important witness," replied the count, softening his tone and smiling slightly. But the stubborn Viscount still did not understand what was going on and what tricks the young man was using. But Lyra could no longer bear it, because her intestines were more like a barrel of rotten herring, so tightly closed that the gases accumulated in it were about to blow the bottom off. She hissed horribly, not mincing her words, so that the Viscount would untie her quickly. "It's going to leak," she let out a heart-rending cry of complaint. This cry echoed off the cold, thick walls of Shaken Castle. When the initial discomfort had subsided, Lyra knelt and promised to fulfill the Count's wishes. Then she obediently disappeared from his bedroom, leaving him with the Viscount. To deceive the man behind Lyra, One needed a capable horse, and the young count had already calculated everything. When the Viscount turned to him again, Callias responded with a look from his merciless eyes, clouded by the mud of the swamp. Of course, Russell had many questions. He wanted to know where all this knowledge came from. It was unlikely that the Viscount would believe the Count if he said he had simply read it in a book. Reading such books would surely earn him the death penalty. And besides, such dangerous and forbidden things were not kept in the castle, the Viscount reminded him, making the Count shudder. A chill ran down Callias's spine. It was also impossible to say that he was from another world. A dim-witted drill sergeant would hardly be impressed by complex descriptions. And then he reminded him of the dagger that had recently pierced his noble chest. Of course, Russell remembered, because he had pulled it out himself. But why ask such a question? The dagger was a family heirloom that Callias had inherited from his mother. There were legends that the dagger possessed special powers, and now he could say with certainty that they had not arisen out of thin air. But even such a cunning lie was met with skepticism by Russell. The secret of this heirloom can only be revealed by feeling the sharpness of the dagger with your heart. The young Count justified himself. Such a thing should have been known long ago, the Viscount still objected. The Count agreed with him. And then he asked Russell if he had heard of Claire's dagger. The Countess's dagger is the real Claire dagger, the Viscount marveled, casting aside his wariness. They've been caught, thought the young Count with relief. Claire's dagger is a treasure among treasures, if it really belongs to the Count. That explains everything, Russell concluded. And Callias, satisfied with his lie, sat down on a soft bench, having never seen this artifact with his own eyes. But then the Viscount blurted out his stubborn, however, and the young man was as if nailed to the spot. "Who else knows about this?" asked the old servant, pressing him with all his authority. And the young Count immediately replied that he had only told him. Satisfied with this explanation, the old soldier respectfully withdrew. Then Callias changed the subject and asked the Viscount what he thought of Lyra's story. All the old Count's movements had been revealed, Callias reminded him, and he had already managed to familiarize himself with some of the events that had taken place before his incarnation here. The 7th class knight was suddenly attacked and killed along with his retinue, Callias said doubtfully. How could anyone believe such a silly story? The Viscount understood what the young Count was getting at. He needed his power. As a servant, he was forbidden to take sides in the battle for the inheritance. But he had no doubt that Count Colin's death was deliberate, even though they lacked evidence. Despite this, the Viscount was firmly convinced that a soldier should not interfere in politics. He was about to respond to the young Count, but the latter interrupted him with an angry exclamation, asking why his father had to die and who was behind it. Only by finding out would he be able to bring the scoundrels to justice, said the Count, and looked at his servant with a ruthless smirk. These words had an effect, for the Viscount was loyal to the boy's father and had served him all his life. The Kosharin family had orchestrated the assassination, and if Granben, the son of the current countess, took the Count's place, it would be too late for revenge, exclaimed Callias, adding that one must not give up even if it seems difficult. After delivering this tirade, the young Count waited patiently to see what effect it would have on the old soldier's mind. Seeing that he was hesitating, Callias continued to press him, asking if it was chivalrous to serve the people who had killed his master and tried to kill his direct heir. At these words, the Viscount himself was overcome with anger and began to tremble. Then this heavy, bear-like man resolutely knelt down. He swore allegiance to the young Count, just as he had once sworn to his father. Callias smiled. His position in this world had just been strengthened. The old knight turned to his master and asked him never to forget that he had just renounced the beliefs he had followed for nearly 6 decades. The Viscount was a 6th-class strongman and the most powerful man in the county. With him as an ally, Callias could be confident in his future. In essence, he had always been a tiger who kept himself in the strict bonds of the law. But now, for the sake of revenge, he was ready to loosen them. In order not to offend the dignity of the old warrior, Callias asked him to rise, as he himself was still young and did not even have the title of knight, and therefore did not deserve such an honor. Russell replied with unexpected zeal that the young Count should not worry, for he would definitely make him stronger and help him. So eagerly that Callias realized that if he did not change the subject, they would start training right away. So he returned to their plans. Now they had trump cards against the Countess with her failed assassination attempt, and they had both a witness and poison in their hands. "Let the revenge begin," said the young Count, and smiled devilishly. Russell replied with a soldier's yes and asked what would be required of him. The county council had been in session since early morning, with all members present. The Countess took the head seat, believing she had every right to do so, and fanned herself with a wine-red fan. Although her beauty had faded slightly with age and she was cold to everyone, no one doubted how she had been able to charm the old count, now deceased. Covering her face with her fan and shedding a theatrical tear, she announced the news, tragic for some and not for others, that last night the young count had taken his own life by drinking a poison called slow death, or tears of mercy among the common people. A tense silence hung in the air. The vassals and courtiers were stunned by the news, as well as by the fact that the countess was taking the count's place. An old man was the first to speak, saying in a voice as creaky as door hinges that suicides often resort to this cowardly means. Death from this poison was inevitable. A murmur of excitement spread through the hall. With the death of the heir, the countess now controlled all the politics of the house, and the positions of many vassals became precarious. But the countess's entourage straightened their wings and shoulders, and they exchanged glances with the old man who had spoken first. It became clear to everyone that the countess's son, whom she had given birth to in her first marriage, would be declared the next count, and since he had not yet reached the age of majority, the countess herself would be his representative. Callias listened to all this while sitting in his office. It was getting more and more interesting. The main drama was already unfolding on stage, and it was time for them to make their move. Viscount Russell struck the stone floor with his heavy sword. He was clad in knight's armor, as if he were going to war, which in a sense he was. The countess, meanwhile, was enjoying her triumph, completely unaware, and glancing sideways at her stout son with his silly face. Then the door was kicked open with a boot. The countess immediately recognized the long blonde hair of the young count, and froze as if she had seen a dead man or a ghost. But the young count was in good health, alert and ruddy, and behind him walked the unyielding Viscount Russell, who, with his heavy footsteps, resembled a moving bastion. A gasp of surprise escaped the countess's throat when she realized that she was not looking at a ghost, but a flesh and blood person. The appearance of the young heir once again threw everything into confusion and caused murmurs among the council. With her previous statement, the countess had effectively confessed to the attempted assassination, and now she trembled with rage, realizing that she had been betrayed. "This throne does not belong to her," the young heir declared loudly and clearly, pointing at the conspirator without any respect. Regaining her composure, the stepmother reminded him that she was still a countess and asked about Callias's well-being, as if she had not been trying to improve it. With a crazy grin on his face, Callias described to her all the delights of the poison he had taken. But fortunately, because he immediately vomited, he managed to survive. The countess frowned and clicked her tongue nervously. However, she immediately went on the offensive, wanting to seize the initiative, and declared that it was wrong to mislead everyone without verifying her words. To which the young count only snorted contemptuously, as it was too weak and uncertain an attack. Even if he did not recognize her as his mother, it was unseemly to speak to his stepmother as if she were a murderer. And she could not forgive that, declared the countess, her voice rising in excitement and nerves, so that she even jumped up from her seat. Since they were in the great hall, he had to take responsibility for his words, and even for such broad insinuations that could cast a shadow on her honor. Callias smiled again. There was no need to worry about the countess's honor, because you can't worry about something that doesn't exist. Will she be as confident when the truth is revealed to everyone? The young count asked her. The stepmother frowned even more, not knowing what cards and trump cards the boy had in his hands and how much he knew, so she waited for him to make his move. Callias nodded more to his thoughts than to the wicked countess and clapped his hands. "Let's hear what the witness has to say," he declared when Lyra, bound like a prisoner, entered the council chamber accompanied by guards. She walked with her head bowed, resigned to her fate. The countess broke out in a cold sweat at the thought that Lyra could have betrayed her. The maid knelt before everyone. Callias demanded that she give her name. The countess's son stared at the maid with a dumbfounded expression. "Lyra?" said the girl in the green dress. The duchess completely stopped controlling her face, and the fragile mask of indifference slipped away again. Then Lyra declared that she was a member of the 1st Special Forces unit of the Dark Forces belonging to the Kosharan clan. Callias demanded that she explain herself more clearly. The Dark Force is a special unit consisting of young people with high combat skills who undergo combat training at the Plateau Camp, where the best of the best who have completed the training are selected. They all live under false names and carry out various missions in different parts of the continent. And Lyra dutifully played the role of Countess Stella's maid. Without a tremor in her voice, the poisoner betrayed her mistress, causing her face to contort with a spasm again. She flashed lightning from her eyes but could not object. Callias continued his interrogation and asked Lyra if Lady Stella knew about her mission. The girl nodded affirmatively. Of course, Lady Stella screamed at the top of her lungs, denying everything and wringing her hands, calling it all a conspiracy, lies, and slander. Lyra had served her for 5 years, and a worried murmur spread among the nobles. Impersonation was severely punished by galley slavery or hard labor, and realizing which way the wind was blowing, many immediately suggested blaming the Kosherin family for everything, since they had such a witness. The old man who had recently been barking at the Countess now bit his tongue, and everything swam before his eyes. Along with the Countess, his position at the Count's court was ruined, so he turned to the Viscount and demanded that he stand up for Stella. Even the old soldier was shaken by such insolence. Only a fool would cover up for his master's murderers and conspirators. They had in their hands not a modest servant, but a criminal who had confessed to belonging to another house and spying for them, and he demanded that everyone listen to her testimony to the end, and only then draw conclusions. The old man still tried to object and mumbled something incomprehensible, but other voices and the old count demanded that the chief treasurer remain silent, and once this had been done, they cheered up again. The treasurer slumped and scurried back to his place like a frightened spider. The interrogation continued, and the more the captive, now a witness, spoke, the paler Lady Stella's face became. The heir mercilessly continued to extract details of the espionage case, and then it came out that Lyra had been regularly sending information from the treasurer's book, created by Gidlos, to the county of Kosherin. She was also the one who had been tracking the movements of the late Earl Colin and reporting on the mood of his vassals. Russell's face darkened like a storm cloud when he realized the extent of the treachery in the family he had served so loyally and blindly. Other nobles also began to loudly condemn these actions. Then, Callias moved on to the main accusation, which he had left for last, and Lyra confessed that she had forced the heir to drink the slow death poison, and then sneak into his bedroom to disguise his death as suicide and leave a fake will. Lyra confessed to everything. What was the outcome? Callias continued to ask in a chilling and authoritative voice. The poisoner laid everything out as it was. Despite the fact that she had managed to make the heir drink the poison, she was later caught in his chambers by Sir Russell. Unable to bear it and losing the last of her sanity, Lady Stella expressed herself in a manner unbefitting a lady of her status, and ordered the wretch to shut her mouth. She would have lunged at her across the table to scratch her eyes out and strangle her, like a drunken girl of easy virtue in a cantina. But the advisor and her foolish son managed to restrain the crazed countess. Callias sighed indifferently. Since she demanded proof and refused to admit her guilt, they had no choice, and he signaled to Russell. He presented everyone with the fake will of Callias's heir, and unrolled the scroll so that everyone could see that such a document really existed. Last night, he personally seized Lyra after she left it on the heir's table. In his other hand was the well-known scroll called the Memory of the Earth. It is known for its ability to reproduce the evil thoughts of those who touch it, and with its help, it was authentically established who gave instructions to the spy. The treasurer fidgeted in his chair again, realizing that he had to immediately prevent the leak and silence Russell. The nobles from Lady Stella's clique exchanged nervous glances. This did not escape Callias's notice. He had a means of proving the Countess's guilt to everyone. So he shouted again so that he could be heard outside the hall and ordered them to enter. Immediately, a whole platoon of heavy armored soldiers entered the council hall, clanking with weapons and armor. Accompanied by the astonished glances of the aristocrats, the knights passed behind them. Now, behind each of them stood a heavy armored knight with a sword, and no one could doubt the fairness of the investigation or, so to speak, clear the Countess of the charges. Lady Stella shuddered at their presence, her poison unable to penetrate the tightly drawn visors of their helmets. Now that order and safety were once again guaranteed, they could continue. Treasurer Giddles demanded an explanation in his nasty, squeaky voice, which sounded as if his throat had dried up like a stream in the desert. Russell explained that he had already checked the contents of the Scroll of Earth's memory, and therefore decided to take measures in advance, so that no one would disturb the order. Knights in the Sacred Hall, this is a coup, some nobles protested. The Countess's son looked at her with the eyes of a hunted hare, and was on the verge of tears. If he had even a drop of his mother's prudence, he would have already understood what was going on, which is why Lady Stella took him everywhere with her, knowing that he could not cope without her. Unlike her foolish son, the Countess already understood everything. Their brilliant plan had failed, and now that the knights, who had previously remained neutral, had openly sided with Callias, there was no easy way out of this room. Right now, she was completely powerless, like a snake whose fangs had been torn out and could only spit venom. Callias casually asked Russell if he remembered what punishment awaited a nobleman who had sworn to kill the heir to a noble family. "The gallows," the Viscount said clearly, as if counting coins, and Stella distinctly felt the noose of hemp rope tightening around her neck. And then she did what any mother would do. She hugged her son and declared that Granbine had nothing to do with it, and that she had carried out the whole plan herself. Even though they were not related by blood, she was still his mother. The calculating heartbreaker appealed to her maternal instincts. Without much hope of softening the young count's heart, she still begged him to spare her son. Lyra thought about it. Would the countess herself have spared anyone if Callias had been in her place? The count smiled kindly, implying that he was the most generous person in the world, and asked Lyra if it was true that Granbane had nothing to do with it. But her words destroyed the last straw that the count's widow was clinging to. Lyra admitted that when she received the countess's order, her son was present with her. "Falsehood!" cried the countess again in pain and despair, pressing her foolish, chubby son to her chest, real bitter tears now streaming down her face. The enemy left them no loophole. The trap was closed, and she was well aware of this, for she herself knew how to set traps without any pity for her victims. Of course, it was all a lie. Callias smiled. But who would bother to figure it out now, since the gravity of her crime was undeniable? So why not drag her dim-witted brother into this mess as well? Who would have thought that those who planned to kill Callias would turn out to be such cowards? The soldier's strong and reliable hands pressed Lady Stella against the table, not at all embarrassed by her high status. And so ended the first fox hunt. Callias smiled triumphantly, making no attempt to hide his satisfaction. The countess hissed and cursed profusely. Her foolish son, dressed in ridiculous frills, suddenly slammed his hands on the table and turned to his stepbrother. Sensing that Granbane was about to do something even more foolish, the countess warned him. But her son did not listen and fell at Callias's feet, forgetting his honor and dignity. In doing so, he humiliated himself and his family even more than before. This caused quite a few surprised exclamations. Even more absurdly, the foolish brother began to beg for mercy for his mother, promising to accept any punishment. Lady Stella was stunned by this statement. There was no chance that she would be spared. She screamed for Granbane to return to his place, but he did not listen. The nobles began whispering again, indignant that the second heir had knelt. However, some considered it a chivalrous and noble gesture, for he was defending his mother. This made Callias look bad, as if he were a cruel executioner. He looked again at his ridiculous, chubby stepbrother, and he clenched his teeth in anger. Then, pulling himself together, he patted him on the shoulder and, with the smile of a merciful angel, promised to help, since he was so worried about his mother. A glimmer of hope appeared on the chubby boy's wide, expressionless face, as if he still thought, like a child, that it was enough to simply apologize and promise not to do it again, and then all his sins would be forgiven. But Callias was ruthless and declared that if his brother admitted his guilt, he would soften his mother's punishment. And then Granbane realized what a trap he had fallen into. But words fly away like birds and cannot be caught. And Callias reminded him once again that later it would be impossible to change his testimony. Therefore, his poor brother should be more careful with his words. Naturally, his mother, Lady Stella, immediately clucked like a broody hen and ordered her son to remain silent. Even though they weren't real brothers, Granbane was older than him, so Callias had no right to order him around. The caught fox wouldn't let up. But the wavering nobles were again overcome by doubt as soon as they managed to present the countess and her son in a better light. No sooner had they begun to think better of them than she took another ill-advised step, lamented the treasurer. All eyes turned to Callias again, waiting for him to speak. But he, like a capricious aristocrat, ordered Russell to arrest the criminal. The two guards still hesitated in indecision, and then they carried out the order, much to Lady Stella's horror. In front of her son, they handcuffed the countess. Granby closed his eyes pitifully as a gag was inserted into her mouth. He huddled on the floor as if he wanted to sink through it, resigned to his fate. Callias returned to where they had started, and asked, in the tone of a judge and executioner, whether his brother admitted his guilt in trying to poison him. And Granbane reluctantly admitted it. Such submission was apparently intended to soften his heart, thought the young count. But he was not fooled by his stepbrother's pitiful appearance. As long as he lived, his claim to the inheritance would remain alive. Russell watched everything in silence. Since the criminal himself had admitted his guilt, the magical scroll of the Earth's memory, which could tarnish the family's honor, would not be used, Callias announced to everyone. And since he had confessed of his own free will, before charges were brought, the sentence should be mitigated. But to ensure the sincerity of the repentant criminal, he must immediately seal his manacor. These were the harsh conditions that the young count imposed on his defeated enemies. And God knows, few could say what was worse for Granbane, so he was genuinely horrified that his opponent knew nothing of mercy and leniency. The kingdom of Raqqa is a glorious land of knights, where everyone knows their place in society from birth. and only service in the army allowed strong and talented young people to awaken their aura and strengthen their bodies. Strength opened the way to advancement, glory, and wealth. Sealing his own mana core was tantamount to committing suicide, condemning himself to a despicable life as a commoner. Not knowing what to do, the chubby boy turned to his mother again, like a beaten puppy. But she could not help him with advice or angry shouts, and only gnawed at the steel rod in helpless rage and fury as if wanting to bite through it. Thus the stepbrother found himself between Scylla and Charybdis. If he did not accept the terms, his mother's sins would be publicly acknowledged, and she would be executed in disgrace in the square. Lady Stella fought fiercely in the guard's hands until white foam came out of her mouth. As a mother, she understood perfectly well that if her son sealed his core, he would be doomed to a miserable existence. After thinking for a moment, the weakling sighed heavily, and, as if gathering the last remnants of his pride, he demanded that Callias give his word that he would soften the sentence for his mother. Russell answered for his master and made a promise. Then Granbane decisively unrolled the scroll, clenched it between his teeth, and touched his stomach, where his meager mana core rested beneath folds of fat. Tears streamed down Stella's cheeks. Even the Grand Master could not restore a sealed core. But the son did not heed his mother's silent protests, and guided by blind filial love, tore the parchment, completing the ritual. A bright flash of light flashed, and a stream of power struck the young count in the face. Then the light emanating from Granbane's navel began to fade, as if someone had turned down the wick of an oil lamp. And before everyone's eyes, Granbane deprived himself of the opportunity to become a warrior. Although his foolish face and ungainly figure, more reminiscent of a dumpling, made it difficult to recognize any military zeal, but his fondness for sweets was obvious. The Countess's face was not dry from salty, bitter tears, but few felt any pity for her. You reap what you sow. Granbane felt an unusual emptiness inside. Everything turned out to be not as painful as he had expected. Even his mother fell silent and stopped struggling, resigned to her fate. Her foolish son had fallen victim to his own naivety. Chubby turned to his mother and looked at her with his foolish face, finding the strength to even smile, because he had always wanted to be an artist. But the words of comfort had the opposite effect on Lady Stella, and she resumed her attempts to free herself. Until, with a devilish effort, she tore apart the thin thread that held her gag like a horse's bit, and then burst into curses promising to support them for the rest of their lives. She screamed so loudly that she could have been mistaken for an evil witch, and perhaps she was. For someone who couldn't gather mana inside, the third class was the limit of available power. At best, Granbane could count on the combat power of the captured maid. Pukliash himself shed a tear and began to comfort his mother, completely unaware that all his torment was yet to come. It cannot be said that he felt comfortable in the shoes of a young count, even though in such an era of blood and steel, it was commonplace to settle scores with rebellious relatives and execute criminals, and the gallows were not even dismantled in the squares before the next guest arrived. Still, he felt uncomfortable, like a man from a more humane era. Callias shook his head nervously and forced himself to think of them as nothing more than game characters. Now he had no right to show weakness or pity. Russell glanced at his young master with a surprised look, not understanding what was wrong with him. Callias noticed that he was being watched and froze. Then he cleared his throat with a single cough. This boat has sailed, and there's no turning back, he thought. Out loud, he ordered the Viscount to finish the remaining business. He turned his gaze back to the conspirators, and everyone in the hall remained reverently silent. Until the investigation was complete, Lady Stella and her son Granbane were to remain in custody in the dungeon, Callias concluded. He also forbade anyone from negotiating with them. The guards led the criminals away, hunched over and disgraced. At that moment, a slight sadness touched the young count's eyes, but only for a moment. Then the treasurer, Gidlos, was also charged with espionage, which turned the already gray, mouse-like face of the decrepit old man ashen. Russell announced to everyone that this man had been removed from office and arrested. The old rogue went limp in the firm hands, but even the thick purse of gold he carried with him could not keep his body in place, and the guards dragged him into the depths of the castle. On the way, he imprudently allowed himself to speak ill of one of the knights, who rightly considered it an insult to his honor. Therefore, he deservedly rewarded the no longer venerable old man with a blow from his armored glove to his soft belly. At that moment, the stream of indignation and curses from the former treasurer's mouth dried up, and he somehow fell silent. Callias made a mental note to treat knights with respect according to their rank. The chairs burned under the other court vassals, especially among those who had so kindly played along with the countess. Callias glanced at their fretful faces with a cold look. Even if the young count did not yet have the support of other nobles, he had the knights of the castle on his side, which was more important than any scheming at the moment, so even knowledge of the law could not save them from his wrath. With their silence, the courtiers confirmed that the question of succession was closed, and that the boy was now their master, the young count. The boy wasted no time and studied each person's face. Then he smiled sweetly, sending a chill down the spines of many, and called the head of security. The latter involuntarily gasped and began to invoke the Holy Virgin Mary in vain, as if the devil himself had appeared before him. Sir Russell also placed him under arrest, relieving him of all duties until the end of the investigation. The nobles, unaccustomed to such harsh treatment of their trembling persons, turned pale. But then one of them, sitting to the right of the countess, bowed low and repented before the young count. He was dressed in a green cassock and a strange turban on his head, and because he had failed to detect the seeds of treason in time, he voluntarily resigned from his post. Callias thought about it. This courtier's name was Gerard, and he had a good reputation and skills, so it was necessary to be careful with him. Fortunately, he and Russell had discussed everything before going on stage. The Viscount refused to dismiss the nobleman. Moreover, he provided him with a list of people who were involved in the assassination attempt in one way or another. All those named in it were to be dismissed from their posts, and the Viscount left the decision on this matter to Sir Garrett, urging him to act in such a way that it would not hinder the prosperity of their lands. But the young Earl also wanted to have his say and stepped forward. He clarified that all the treasury clerks, except for 4, would be investigated. Therefore, they needed a new treasurer, Callias declared firmly, like a true ruler. Garrett immediately asked for leniency for those who were guilty unintentionally. The sudden dismissal of a large number of officials could seriously harm the cause, said the manager. Callias was firm in his decision that when it came to money, one should rely only on those who could be trusted completely. Then he asked if Sir Garrett feared losses, but the latter shook his head uncertainly. "Perhaps these people will appreciate kindness and mercy," asked the young earl. "Or perhaps they want to insult him," he immediately suggested. "It was just a mistake," Garrett said weakly in his defense. But these objections were easily dismissed by the boy who spoke like a man and a ruler. "Everything has already been decided," Callias declared imperiously, in a tone that brooked no argument. Garrett shuddered at his voice, and the boy he knew, weak and downtrodden, despised by all, disappeared. Gone too was the innocent child he had once known. Among the nobles, Viscount Russell was considered a master of the sword, while Garrett was a knight of the pen. But even he could not find a reply to the young count. Callias smiled slightly, enjoying the fear and confusion in their eyes. Now all power in the county belonged to him, and for a long time to come, the nobles would not dare to plot against him. And then a blue light struck his eyes, which only he could see, and he began to carefully study the list of characteristics of Baron Garrett, who was only slightly older than Russell and boasted S-rank management talent. Following this, the count studied the status of each nobleman, slowly examining their faces. Meanwhile, Garrett studied the list Russell had given him. Without the blue screens, whose main asset was absolute reliability, the investigation would have dragged on for a long time. Status could easily reveal membership in another house, thus determining who was a spy and who was not. The first thing to do was to deal with those who were still undecided, as well as the many completely talentless and useless schemers whom the Countess had brought in to increase her influence at court. Callias was determined to pluck these fat geese and leave only those who openly expressed their loyalty to him. His smirk only made the courtiers more terrified. They avoided his gaze and looked nervously at each other, waiting for someone to stand up for them all. But there were no brave souls among the Knights of the Pen. Instead, there were plenty of sycophants who wanted to keep their positions, and they immediately rushed to the Count, clucking about their loyalty. So the Count even had to gently dampen their enthusiasm, saying that they had plenty of time and no need to rush. Viscount Russell stood aside and silently watched the Count. His own head was already spinning from all the intrigues, which he deeply despised, preferring open combat face to face, no matter how formidable the enemy. The council meeting lasted until evening, when the first stars appeared in the sky. Callias felt squeezed like a lemon, as if he had worked a shift in the mines as a miner, and collapsed onto his bed. But a satisfied smile played on his face. He had done an excellent job of strengthening his position, so his fatigue was pleasant. Until that day, his whole life had gone according to plan. Boring and monotonous, predictable, an ordinary schoolboy with nothing remarkable about him. He had become just another adult, an ordinary office worker, and it was hard to imagine how he would have lived if fate had not made him a hero. So he became the first person to pass this difficult, treacherous game of life and ascend to the throne. And then, when he thought it was all over, he was brought back to this world again, but as an ordinary person. And then he remembered that the game ended with his ascension to the throne. Those were the conditions. Callias jumped up nervously in bed. Everything suddenly fell into place. When he had completed the game, without knowing it, he had wished to be reborn in it, and now his wish had come true. He realized with horror that he had brought this adventure upon himself with only one life and one attempt. However, it was too late to lament his fate, because nothing could be changed now, and the young count fell back onto the soft feather pillow. He could only hope that if he ascended the throne again, he would be able to make another wish. And then, promising himself to achieve the throne, he sank into the embrace of sleep. Confident in his safety, his sleep was deep and his breathing even. The morning greeted him with rays of sunlight shining brightly through the bedroom windows. Where to start, the young count wondered, barely stretching his stiff shoulders. Although he knew everything about the game, he had never heard of the county of Shaken, and therefore did not even know where it was located. This meant he needed a map, however inaccurate it might be. Fortunately, there was one in the system, and it was immediately provided to the player. It looked simply beautiful, like a real treasure map, and it showed all the secret places and treasures he knew from the game, so the young count immediately began to salivate. There were also marks that he had not seen before, probably a reward for completing the game, the boy thought. The count rocked back and forth on the bench with excitement, and then he suddenly remembered that he had no idea what year it was. The status highlighted the year 289 of the imperial calendar, 5 years before the hero's destiny began. At the same time, he was in a county he knew nothing about. Surely these lands would be conquered in 5 years, the count thought with horror. He remembered Russell saying that their only problem was money, which is why they couldn't even afford a maid who didn't want to poison him. Callias immediately requested a financial report for his county, but when he saw it, he clutched his head in despair, and then the castle resounded with choice expletives, completely unbecoming of a noble person. The report made him think of taking everything he had and running away, which was much easier than sorting things out. But money is land, and you can't hide it in your pocket. He needed to earn money urgently, because the county's lands, which the Shaken family had multiplied with sweat and blood, were mortgaged, and it was a pity to give them away just like that. For this reason, Callias sank even deeper into the financial hole that was the county treasury. On average, the county's lands were even more fertile than others, so they received a hefty tax, but in the past, they exceeded their defense costs. Debts multiplied, as did payments on them due to late payments. Callias spent the whole day studying the invoices, and was terribly tired after reviewing everything from the last 10 years. The first problem was that the Gorda Plateau had stopped trading with the desert kingdom of Madroa. This meant that the county could not trade either, and their income had fallen. The situation was critical. Interest on debts had already exceeded annual income, and it was a black hole that threatened to drag them to the bottom of bankruptcy and poverty. And that's not all. The young count had found the debt notes, so now his heart was being clawed at by cats. He urgently needed useful information, and then a brilliant idea came to him. Because the county's main treasury was hidden from the darkness and dampness in the castle dungeon, Treasurer Giddos himself. So the count himself headed for the dungeon, which was accessed by a steep spiral staircase. He walked carefully so as not to slip on the wet steps. The last thing he needed was for the young count to be killed or maimed by such a ridiculous accident. The jailer, who did not expect to see the count here, rubbed his eyes and greeted him awkwardly, trying his best to pretend that he had not been sleeping on duty. Callias paid no attention to this and demanded to be taken to the former treasurer. Besides, the smell of sewage that filled the dungeon did not encourage a long visit. The guard obeyed and led the prince down a corridor lined with rather uncomfortable-looking apartments. To lighten the silent and tense atmosphere, the guard decided to chat with him, perhaps not fully awake himself. This young man had been appointed to be in charge of security, replacing the previous nobleman, and it was clear from his boasting that he did not particularly respect the young count. Callias suddenly stopped. He looked at the new head of security, who had his own inclinations. Narrowing his eyes slyly, Callias declared that they should give those who had been taken into custody a chance to justify themselves. The guard liked this idea and clapped his hands in satisfaction. However, the reinvestigation had to be conducted with greater care so that no criminal would be released, and he entrusted this task to the new captain. Flattered by such an honor, he immediately saluted his new boss. Nevertheless, Callias remained wary of him, because the new captain was so quick to betray his former boss. Perhaps he was trying to strengthen his relationship with the young count. Callias reminded him of his manners, and the new captain saluted again. After all, this man was not so different in nature from the nobleman he despised so much, and they went to the treasurer's office. When they stopped at the barred door, Callias peeked out from behind the captain's back. The pathetic old man was still showing off his aristocratic origins and whining that the food in the dungeon was bad. The bed was uncomfortable and the mattress was full of bedbugs. But he was about to be released, he threatened the silent guards. And who would release him, the Count wondered, suddenly appearing before the corrupt treasurer. Perhaps he plans to escape like a rat or crawl away like a worm, Callias suggested contemptuously. The treasurer, as if he had learned nothing from his dire situation, arrogantly declared that he had been waiting for the Count. After all, he had come to repay his debt, which caused confusion on his face. And then the Count reminded Sir Giddos that he had better think about how to weave a strong rope from his beard and hang himself from the beam, otherwise he would regret it greatly. The guard pretended not to hear the threats against the accused, whose trial was not yet over. But the treasurer only laughed nastily in his nasty, squeaky voice, for he had worked here for many years, even if he had ended up in such a position, and so he knew perfectly well why the Count had honored him with a visit. Callias dismissed these statements, reminding the forgetful nobleman of his past as treasurer, but the old man was well aware that the boy had come here to find out about the enormous debt of his estate. To be honest, at that very moment, Callias wanted to call the executioner and use a red-hot iron to explain to the old man his place, and he barely restrained himself, remembering his origins from a more humane age, and the greedy old man's gray face broke into a smug grin. This was the last straw that broke the camel's back. He asked the head of security if they had a torture chamber. Then he ordered the chief interrogator to be summoned immediately. Seeing how the new captain hesitated and wavered, the Count raised his voice at him, for he was not wearing a jester's cap, but was, after all, a count. Then the captain stood up straight, as if he had been whipped, and gave a short, "Yes, sir." Then he rushed off to carry out the order. The Count's youthful appearance had caused him to lower his guard and forget himself. So now the captain reproached himself for having incurred the wrath of a titled person. Callias smiled maliciously. Only in this era could a man wield such complete power over his lands. The old man fidgeted nervously on the cold floor of the cell, where there was not even a bench, as if the interrogator's red-hot tongs had already reached him. The young Count, seeing his confusion, added fuel to the fire and wished the old man not to give up his soul to God in the first few minutes. Although, if he begged him tearfully, he, as a count, would soften his fate and grant him a slow death, said Callias with a merciful smile. The world faded before the eyes of the pitiful old man. He suddenly shrank and aged a good 10 years. His green eyes, which had previously looked like an old swamp, now sparkled brightly in the darkness of the cold chamber. "He's the devil," thought Giddos. "I swear to God he's the devil," he repeated to himself. And then the former treasurer began to sing like a nightingale, leaving aside his former haughty tone, begging for his life in exchange for valuable information. "Go ahead," said the Count without a moment's hesitation, promising himself that if the information proved useless, he would torture the old man to death. And then the treasurer revealed that all the debts of the Shaken County were in the hands of a merchant named Gerard Milkus. He was also responsible for the Kosherin family's secret vault. It was known that the Viscount of Kosherin used Gerard to steal taxes on mineral extraction and evade royal taxes. "So what?" asked the young Count indifferently. The treasurer, his voice trembling with fear, explained that if these machinations were reported to the king, the debts would not have to be paid. But Callias sharply rejected this plan, as the merchant could simply sell the debt securities at a bargain price before he was arrested. The Viscount of Kosherin would be delighted to buy them. The old man had not thought of this, so confusion was written all over his foolish face. But if he had been smarter, he would not have ended up in prison. And then the captain who had come with the torture master returned. This man looked more like a butcher from the market, holding a huge axe in his hands, and his appearance alone was terrifying. "Just what we need," thought Callias. "You can tell he's a pro." "Have mercy," cried the former treasurer, who surprisingly still had some strength left in him. And then he blurted out that the capital of the Kosherin fund managed by Gerard must exceed 100,000 gold pieces. Callias immediately looked at the old man, as if wondering whether he could be trusted, or whether he was just making things up on the spot to delay the inevitable. But then he showed with his whole demeanor that the information he had received was insufficient. And again he turned to the silent figure of the butcher and executioner. When the gloved hands grabbed Giddos, he became even more talkative and said he knew where Gerard's storehouse was. Now that's something, thought the Count. The old man was thrown onto the cold floor, and he swore by all the saints and his mother that he was not lying and knew exactly where the secret storage room was. Callias shut his mouth with his boot, tired of the pig-like squeals, and asked how he knew this. The old man whimpered pitifully in pain. "Begin," ordered the Count. The executioner's hands grabbed the old man's finger. No tools were needed, for they were stronger than a blacksmith's tongs. And the old man continued singing. saying that he had tried to rob the vault before, but had not succeeded. Giddos pitifully justified himself, saying that if they hadn't robbed Gerard, he would have taken everything from them anyway to pay off his debts. It turned out that the old man had found a couple of thieves and paid them for the job. Then the Count asked contemptuously how much had been paid. At first he heard the number 3, but then he asked again. 300 or what? The old man corrected him, saying thousands, and Callias's eyes widened. From his gaze, the thieving treasurer understood that his life would not be long. And then the young Count laughed a mad laugh that made even the captain and the executioner's hair stand on end. The captain was already thinking of quietly strangling the old man before he angered the Count even more. 3,000 was a huge sum, roughly what the county received in 6 months. It was impossible to obtain such funds honestly, which meant that the old man had brazenly stolen them. Giddos fell to his knees and begged for forgiveness again, saying that he had no choice, because the key to the vault was a crystal ball. The Count was surprised by this information. A duplicate of the magic ball cost 2,500, the rest was for the work. The treasurer quickly explained. Perhaps he could find a clue here, thought Callias. After thinking for a moment, he concluded that the greedy and foolish treasurer had simply been duped. Most likely the thief and Gerard Milkus knew each other personally, the Count concluded. Giddos let out a nervous cry. He had seen the entrance to the vault with his own eyes, and how Gerard had opened the vault with a magic crystal. Callias asked where this place was, and the treasurer said it was on the Gorda Plateau, so the Count immediately called up a map. The old man was blindfolded and did not know the exact location, but the young Count had a divine blessing in the form of a player system. Lost in thought, the Count stared at the emptiness in front of him. So he caught 3 pairs of silent, surprised eyes on himself, and then he easily found the exact location of the repository. But to get to these lands, he needed a guide, someone who knew them well. And then he remembered a young lady who had so carelessly fallen victim to an unsuccessful assassination attempt, and who, in her youth, had undergone special training at a camp on this very plateau. A plan quickly formed in the Count's mind. Having gotten everything he wanted, he called out to the captain and ordered him to come with him. Then the naive old man dared to remind the young Count of his presence. But it was in vain. The Count quickly left, ignoring his plaintive cries. The Count waited until the captain of the guard closed the doors. The treasurer turned out to be an embezzler, and the previous guard had also been bribed. And the more the Count thought about it, the angrier he became. The captain fiddled with the lock suspiciously for a long time, and then Callias called out to him. He then reminded him that their investigation had revealed that the suspect had embezzled 3,000 gold coins, which he himself had confessed to. Of course, the captain could not have known this, and he asserted more than he asked, and the guard heartily agreed with him. He sincerely hoped that the Count would not guess that the captain had already received a bribe from the embezzler. He thought the young gentleman had left, but Callias lingered, and, without turning around, suddenly remembered that the embezzler had told him something interesting while the captain was running after the torture master. Then a chill ran down the captain's spine. He is kind by nature, but isn't that too much? It's so annoying, said Callias, and looked contemptuously at the captain. The captain fell to his knees and began to plead, begging not to be executed. Thinking that the embezzler had already confessed, the captain began to beg for forgiveness. He tearfully promised that he would never do such a thing again, and then dared to raise his eyes to see the Count's reaction. However, the Count had unexpectedly vanished, as if blown away by the wind. The overseer looked back angrily, cursing the despicable embezzler with a quiet, gentle word. He returned to the dungeon, thinking about how he could get even with the traitor as soon as possible. Callias, who had managed to hide behind the wall of the well, smiled at his prank. He didn't even notice someone approaching him from behind. Only a second later did he sense the presence of another, and startled. Who else is there? Wondered the young Count. And already someone's shadow had grown beside him. It was late at night, but the lanterns had not yet been extinguished, so the narrow castle courtyard at the entrance to the dungeon was still well lit. Who is it? Asked the Count cautiously, knowing firsthand the price of betrayal, and he had plenty of enemies after his successful coup. Before him stood a young man with a sword behind his back, but dressed in a simple soldier's shirt. He was tall, perhaps as tall as Sir Russell, and almost as broad-shouldered, and his face, with a high forehead and large eyes, looked directly and openly at the Count. The young man's clothing revealed him to be a knight of the Blue Lion, but the Count, clearly nervous, asked him again what he wanted. Then the young man put his hand on his chest and introduced himself as Kraut Salomon. The Viscount ordered him to follow the Count everywhere and protect him. Callias immediately familiarized himself with the young man's status. He was a good 10 years older than him, had 5th-class combat power, a kind and honest disposition, and excellent military skills. He He seemed quite capable, thought the Count, but unfortunately he didn't remember anything about him, which meant that by the start of the game, this man might already be dead. He had considerable potential to become one of the 100 best warriors on the continent, and besides, people with such military skills were rare. Although perhaps Callias guessed the identity of this knight. He used to live as a simpleton, but then, hiding his face, he turned into a demon who knew no mercy. Even the Black Prince did not know his identity. Perhaps in the future he would become a preacher of death, thought the Count. But it sounded ominous, so he dismissed these assumptions. The preacher of death was thin and gloomy, and the burly man in front of him, with bulging muscles under his shirt, did not look like a corpse. He wrote to everyone with his life, sparkling from his green eyes like spring foliage. Now was not the time to think about trifles. In any case, it was useful to have such a person with him. But then the guy spoke up and pulled the Count out of his thoughts. Kraut looked at Callias with concern, because he had called the Count several times, but he had not responded. Then he announced that the merchant Gerard Milkus wished to meet with the gentleman. He had already heard that name in a place not as pleasant as this cozy courtyard. Of course, he had not forgotten the name of the man who held all the county's debts in his hands. In other words, he held them all by the throat. Without delay, the Count immediately went to the meeting and ordered Kraut to follow him. His new servant may have looked reliable as a bodyguard, but he clearly lacked brains, so it was hard to believe that he would become a preacher of death. Although Kraut was already a mature knight and was close to the much younger Count, he still did not know what to expect from him, so he remained confused. But duty obliged the knight to accompany his master everywhere. He opened the living room for him where, despite the late hour, the ill-fated merchant and creditor was waiting, having heard about the commotion in the county and rushing over to make sure his loan would be repaid. The young Count entered with silent dignity, holding himself proudly, even contemptuously, as was proper when dealing with commoners, even if they were rich. Gerard greeted him first. He was a tall man, balding early, with a long, thin face. His oriental costume and forced, welcoming smile gave him away as a merchant and moneylender, just a bigger one. They were not personally acquainted, so Gerard introduced himself first, as the head of a small trade guild. Callias replied sarcastically, because although the guild was small, it was very profitable. But he immediately added warmly that he was always happy to meet successful merchants, and when it came to acting, Callias himself could give the merchant a run for his money. He responded with polite but useless flattery, saying things like, "Your words are music to my ears," and other such nauseating platitudes. Callias sat down first and did not even offer his companion a seat, showing his true attitude with his whole demeanor. However, he asked him about the purpose of his visit, since he himself had not yet officially entered into succession and had no authority. Gerard laughed as if he had heard a funny joke, and, laughing insolently, he boldly remarked that Viscount Russell would continue to rule here for a long time, since the Count was the direct heir. And now there was no one in his county who could go against his will, added the merchant, demonstrating his thorough knowledge of the internal politics of their house. But Callias coldly dismissed this flattery, stating that he was still one of the two candidates. But Gerard would not be fooled. He had already heard that the dispute over the inheritance had been settled. Amazing awareness, the young Count remarked immediately, since their family had not yet made any official statements. He stared grimly at the merchant, who found it difficult to maintain his mask of friendliness. Without the slightest embarrassment, the insolent merchant replied that in his line of work, awareness was essential. Gerard already understood that the heir before him was not as simple-minded as he had previously been thought to be. Who would have thought that a child not yet 20 years old had so skillfully hidden his cynical and calculating nature all his life? But what excited the merchant even more was that the rumors about the young Count's beauty were not only not exaggerated, but rather understated. Therefore, a disgusting expression flashed across the merchant's face, a man whose insides were rotsier than rotten fish. As if reading his thoughts, Callias shuddered and shivered. He suddenly jumped up from his seat, surprising everyone. Then, in a dead voice, he declared that he did not have much time. He added that if the guest had nothing more to say on the matter, the meeting should end, and his eyes looked cold enough to freeze the blood in one's veins. This gaze could only be described as animalistic fury. As if sensing that one wrong word would cause the Count to take his life, Gerard bowed his head sharply. He wanted to appease the Count, who had suddenly become so cold, so he explained his intense gaze by saying that he was surprised by his beauty, about which he had heard so much. It was hard to say which was worse, the merchant's gaze or his pathetic attempt to justify it. Callias said nothing, only looked on with contempt, but he returned to his seat and told the merchant to get down to business. Gerard also sat down, abandoning his feigned coyness, and said that he had come to discuss the debt that had been passed on to him from the old Count Colin. With a face full of indifference and boredom, playing the carefree young dandy, the Count declared that this was the first he had heard of such a thing, adding that he could say nothing more at the moment because their treasurer was in prison. The young Count's ease of manner made Kraut's head spin, but the merchant did not give up. Of course, the young Count might not know, since the debt was already 5 years old, and he smiled carnally. In his filthy fantasies, sweet thoughts flew about how the pitiful, weak, and glorious boy, upon learning of the amount of the debt, would himself ask for leniency and credit. He had been working toward this for so long that he almost trembled with desire in front of the Count, like a stray dog. According to the agreement, he had the right to demand repayment of the entire loan amount, as well as accrued interest, at any time after 3 years from the date of issue. Gerard tried his best not to smirk, and then he demanded that the debt be repaid in full within 2 weeks. He named the staggering sum of 60,000 gold coins, which made even the Knight's page's jaw drop. That was how much the entire county received in 10 years. How much noise he makes, thought Callias, glancing at the bodyguard. But with him, he felt safe next to the promiscuous merchant. The bodyguard looked at the young Count expectantly, enjoying every reaction and interpreting it in his own way. But Callias was actually indifferent to the threat of bankruptcy. Gerard waited patiently, confident that he would get what he wanted anyway. Callias remained silent in response. The demands were clear, there was nothing more to say. Then Kraut took the liberty of humbly asking for a delay, as if he doubted his master's negotiating skills. Gerard's face turned waxy and seemed to freeze. This was not the reaction he had expected. A long silence ensued. The merchant broke it first and said that although he was sorry, the previous head of the house had undermined his trust. He had wanted to demand repayment of the debt last year, but immediately after the Count's death, it would have been inappropriate. Therefore, it was now the young Count's turn to settle the debt, Gerard concluded. The simple-minded Kraut was completely at a loss and did not know what to do or say. But Callias just watched his opponent closely, who pretended to be a good guy while demanding repayment of a huge debt in just 2 weeks. Then Callias rose again and began his speech. He stated that the county's annual income exceeded this amount, so they would be able to settle the debt. Therefore, he should not tarnish their good name with his doubts. Kraut stared at his master in surprise. Of course, Gerard did not buy this obvious lie. If that were the case, the debt would have been paid off long ago, so he pretended to believe him and clapped his hands in satisfaction. The boy clearly had no means of obtaining the money due to his age. No one in their right mind would give the boy such a sum. This meant that soon the entire county would belong to him. With that, the cunning merchant and creditor took his leave first. The Count remained indifferent. Meanwhile, the merchant was already indulging in all his vile dreams of how to sell the handsome aristocrat who would fall at his feet on the black market. But first, he would take advantage of him himself. At the door, he bowed again, not hiding his joy that the deal was done and that they would soon see each other again. Meanwhile, the disheartened Kraut tried to calculate that he received 2 silver coins a week and that they amounted to the entire sum owed by the shaken county. Callias told him to stop fussing over nonsense and distracting him. This earned him a cry of despair and indignation from his knightly page, who did not understand how one could remain so calm when their lands could be taken away from them for their debts. But the young Count could not tell him that he had already begun hunting for treasure. It was possible to travel light in the vicinity of the castle, but traveling to other lands was no easy task. Dangers could lie in wait for travelers everywhere, especially on the wild Gorda Plateau, which was completely rocky and deserted. There, travelers were threatened not only by random robbers or enemy armies, but also by very dangerous monsters. If this place had not been the only hope of preserving his position, the Count would never have ventured there. And so, that same night, they set off to find someone who knew the ill-fated plateau well, to a killer who valued his life and could still be useful to them in the future. In the bright moonlight, the Count and his servant approached the guard's casemates. As in the dungeon, the guard greeted them with a sleepy and sluggish face. But when he saw the young Count, he immediately perked up. The Count wished to speak with the criminal face-to-face, accompanied by his page. This room had previously been the reception room of the corrupt embezzler Giddos, Kraut reported. However, despite the greed of its former owner, the room itself looked modest and simple, not as Callias had imagined. She just rearranged it, explained the villainess, whose voice the young Count heard and turned around. She valued simplicity, so she threw out unnecessary things designed to dazzle. Now the poisoner came out to them as if she were receiving guests, having changed from her green maid's dress into a white open-backed outfit that did not hide her long legs. The young Count liked what he saw and complimented the girl. Proudly, she accepted it as a matter of course. Over time, the poisoner had completely regained her composure, as if nothing had happened, and treated the Count as an equal. Kraut immediately barked at the criminal like a faithful dog and grabbed the hilt of the sword, which he wore behind his back in a strange fashion, instead of keeping it handy on his belt, where it could be quickly and easily drawn. Lyra did not even flinch and looked at the chained dog with contempt. Callias did not escape her haughty gaze. The girl had already exposed his deception with the poison, which was understandable, because after several hours of shame, which she still found unpleasant to remember, the pain in her stomach had passed. What can you do? The human body has an amazing ability to cleanse itself of all kinds of nastiness. The truth is, she was not even afraid of death, but of the torment that would lead to it. She figured it out even faster than he thought, the Count replied indifferently and humbly, as if that was his intention. The girl brazenly sat down on the table in the Count's presence, and he and Kraut could freely gaze at the white satin skin on her beautiful thighs, which made the latter's chest feel hot. Lyra already understood that since the young Count was here, he still needed her. But what should they do? She asked, slowly examining the young man's face. And then she smiled predatorily and seductively, because she was no longer afraid to resist his will. However, there was one way to persuade her to cooperate, for example, to be alone together and sincerely confess their warm feelings to each other. Lyra, and she added that he would have to work hard. Inexperienced in the subtle matters of women, Kraut again grabbed his sword, shouting about debauchery, but Callias stopped him, and he maintained control without succumbing to her charms. She really does have only one way to survive, the young Count replied coldly, not hiding her annoyance that her charm had not worked, even though it could have struck down many men and made them lose their minds. Lyra clicked her tongue and asked what he meant. Even if they let her go now like a free bird, and she flew out of this cage, she would be killed as soon as she left it, the Count patiently explained to her. When she still did not understand, Callias sighed heavily and then reminded her that they were now openly at war with the House of Kosharin after the failed assassination attempt. There was a moment of silence, during which Kraut did not remove his hand from the hilt of his sword. Of course, Lyra had not forgotten that her former masters, represented by Viscount Kosharin, who had sent her here, cherished their daughter and grandson, who in turn had been forced to seal the Monocore. Callias looked at her with his light eyes, which were becoming increasingly icy blue. It was strange that, knowing all this, Lyra did not see herself as an obstacle, a key witness against Lady Stella. From her troubled face, Callias understood that until that moment, the girl had not thought about it in those terms. Her situation was already dire, and now it had become dangerous. In an alarmed voice, Lyra asked the blonde-haired boy, whose youthful voice chilled her soul, if he should not defend his witness, and then pardon her. To which Callias indifferently replied that he had already achieved his goal. Granbane was out of the game, and there were no other candidates for the title of Count besides him, and it was she who played a key role in the collapse of Viscount Kosharin's long-standing plans to take their county for himself. At these words, the girl in front of him once again felt the ground slipping away from under her feet. No nobleman would allow a commoner who dared to tarnish his honor to live, he added coldly. The noose around her neck tightened again. Lyra had already been through something similar and had seen how people were used like hunting dogs and then discarded when they were no longer needed. But she could not have imagined that the same fate would befall her. Out of resentment for her fate, the villainous girl bit her lip until it bled. Then, grabbing a candlestick from the table, with a sharp needle on which candles were strung, she attacked the young Count in a furious rage. The sharp sting in the hands of a trained person was no less deadly than a dagger. Callias could only watch as the bony woman with the scythe rushed towards him at full speed. Fortunately, the young Count's calculation of Kraut's combat skills proved to be correct. Despite his lack of intelligence, his reflexes were amazing, and he kicked the spy back to the table with his heavy soldier's boot. He shielded the Count with his body and managed to grab his long sword. Callias remained calm, thanked him for saving him, but asked him to be gentler with the girl. After all, she was the one who helped him become the sole heir, and Kraut even apologized. But the Count treated everything simply and indulgently, generously understanding that Lyra, like many people, took out her anger on the one who opened her eyes to the truth, and not on the one whose will and fault had put her in such a position. "Why is that?" Callias asked her. The spy remained silent, only looking at him with the eyes of a hunted animal, thinking only of how to sell her life for the highest price and end it all. They always choose the easy way out. The Count answered his own question and carelessly sat down right next to the one who had already tried to kill him twice. No matter who these people vent their anger, disappointment, and other feelings on, It will indeed make them feel better, but only for a short time. And yet she was not one of those who easily threw away their lives, which meant she should not give up so easily, said Callias, and smiled encouragingly. And there was something in his words and appearance that touched her soul deeply. Of course, she would never die, Lyra blurted out so loudly that she could be heard on the street. Good, replied Callias with a satisfied smile. Such a person would be useful to him. If she helped him, he would protect her from her pursuers, as well as her family, if she had one, the Count assured the girl. Lyra opened her eyes wide in amazement, not understanding how such an offer was even possible. Then she decided that he just wanted to drag her family into this and take them hostage. So she shouted angrily that this would never happen. Callias laughed as if he had heard a funny joke. However, he immediately added coolly, so that the girl would not flatter herself, that there were many killers like her. Of course, she understood this, because she had been a toy in the hands of the nobility her whole life. But she also knew her worth. And even though there were many intelligent people, why was the boy here now? Callias looked closely at the girl, who was still unable to get to her feet after the shock, and thought that she was very smart. The first reason he was here was to save time, Callias replied. And the second was that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, Lyra finished for him, remembering the Roman maxim. The Count smiled slyly and congratulated the girl on her successful use of her brain. Then, Lyra stood up proudly, put her hands on her luxurious hips, stuck out her chest, demanded to be treated as a mercenary with a contract, and declared that she would not do anything beyond its limits. She has no shortage of pride, thought Callias, even though she had just been at his feet in tears, and had tried to kill him again. Even Crute couldn't stand such familiarity with a noblewoman and began to scold the girl. Then Lyra raised her hands in a conciliatory gesture, and the threads on her tight corset crackled. Of course she would be polite to her lord and savior. Now that they were friends, she hoped for Crute's favor. Who must be no stranger to knightly virtues, asked the cunning fox. This made the face of the page and bodyguard contort as if he had swallowed a lemon. Since when are they friends now? Kraut growled. The two immediately disliked each other. He was too ambitious and stubborn, and she was too proud and self-confident. But Callias did not let the quarrel escalate and interrupted them. Now that they had settled the important issue of trust and relations, he moved on to the reason he had come here and asked about the Gorda Plateau. Lyra had been trained at a remote camp on this plateau, and should have known the area well. Then he suddenly shouted, pointing his finger at the knight, telling him to bring the map. A map of the entire kingdom, with a detailed description of the terrain and the lands adjacent to the Kosherin vicarage. Then Kraut remembered that there was a huge map hanging in the barracks hall. Without a moment's hesitation, the Count ordered them to go there immediately. Pleased with the opportunity to serve his master, Kraut opened the doors and invited them to follow him. But Callias glanced strangely to the side and told the knight to go ahead. Surely you know where the barracks are, Kraut asked him directly, and the Count mumbled embarrassedly that of course he knew. And they argued for a long time in front of Lyra about who would go first. Then morning came to the castle, and the sun's rays painted the walls in shades of pink, dispelling the gray and boredom. The large hall in the barracks had a long table, a shelf with many books, and a rack for swords. Soldiers and knights usually rested here. At the end of the hall, a map hung on the entire wall, which immediately caught the young Count's attention. The map had a military slant, so Kraut promised more details and markings on it than on civilian maps. The Count began to study it carefully, looking for the right plateau. Then, pointing his finger, he asked them what they knew about this place. Kraut explained that these lands were an ancient battlefield between the Viscountcy of Kosherin and the Barony of Reborn, where they settled their land disputes. There was also a rich copper deposit on the plateau, but due to the protracted war, mining had now been suspended. Callias checked his player card. Baron Erebon was a vassal of House Shaken. However, the Count himself was dissatisfied with the accuracy of the map, which had not been updated for God knows how long. Lyra, who had spent many years in these lands, stated that no significant changes had taken place, and that there were only a couple of places that needed to be corrected. Now she began to understand why she had been summoned. The girl was absolutely confident in her knowledge of the area. Then she asked the young Count what he was looking for on this rocky plateau, and he replied briefly that he was eager to visit the ancient ruins. Lyra was quite surprised, because she had never heard of any ruins there. The Count thought again. He asked the girl where adults had told her not to go when she was young. Again and again, the young Count impressed her with his maturity, so that Lyra spent some time looking at his young face, thinking that when he grew up he would become a handsome man and a heartbreaker. She had time to regret that by that time she would be too old to compete with the noble ladies for his attention. But then her thoughts turned to business, and she remembered her training camp. To help her, Callias asked if she knew when the Kosherin family had begun training their spies. Lyra calculated that she was a graduate of the 6th class, and since she had begun her service in Shaken County, another 5 years had passed. So it had been about 15 years since the training began. And around the same time, the land disputes with Baron Arbon began, Kraut said. The spy asked the knight if he understood what was going on, but neither of the two new servants understood what was happening yet. Lyra snorted contemptuously. What else could be expected from a soldier? And they immediately started arguing, trying to figure out which of them was smarter and showering each other with insults. But the young count didn't even stop them, he just thought aloud. To prepare a larger army, a lot of money is needed, which means that it is impossible to rapidly increase forces, except in exceptional cases. Lyra still didn't understand what was going on. Their treasury is definitely full to the brim, Kraut replied on behalf of his master, earning himself a grumble from the cat girl. Callias agreed with the bodyguard. Moreover, he assumed that the Kosherin family had acquired some new money, and it was this money that they used to create an army of spies who were sent to serve across the continent, as was the case with Lyra. However, what did this have to do with the ruins, the girl asked. Copper mines are usually found near silver veins, and copper itself often contains silver, Callias noted. Secretly mining silver is a crime against the crown, Kraut pointed out, and whistled involuntarily. Then the young count suggested that they put themselves in the place of Viscount Kosherin. The royal court has a monopoly on the extraction of gold and silver wherever they are found, as well as on the minting of coins from them. But if you act secretly, you can significantly increase your income. So Callias already imagined what the ruins they were looking for would look like. After all, it was the perfect place to hide something. The count wanted to tell them the truth, but he knew they wouldn't believe him anyway, so he just smiled. Lyra suggested that the count wanted to seize the mines, but doubted that the county had enough strength to hold them. Although it was sad to admit it, even Kraut understood that the girl was right. Besides, Lyra added, even if the venture was successful, the other side would only have to report the mines to the crown, and then they would be taken away anyway, so it would be better to report them first. But Callias disagreed with her, saying that it would not do them any good, and the investigation would take a long time. They were on the verge of bankruptcy and needed money right now. And right now, their enemies had plenty of silver that they had stubbornly saved up until this moment, and they couldn't put it into circulation in large quantities, which meant there was a secret storage facility, the count explained to them. So if they shook the Viscount's purse a little, he would be offended, but he would not be able to sue them, because the silver did not exist. This plan sounded devilishly cunning, so both the knight and the spy were impressed by it. That same night, without delay, they began to prepare. Several people gathered at the edge of the outer wall of the castle, and Viscount Russell joined them. He was concerned that the heir had decided to leave the castle accompanied by Kraut, who was still as green as a grape. He warned that sooner or later they might encounter something that would be beyond their capabilities. For a second, the young count felt like a beloved grandson. Of course, he understood that if he went with them, Russell would have nothing to worry about. But he also believed in the potential of his bodyguard. Flattered by such praise, the knight blushed with pride, especially since someone had to guard the castle in his absence, especially in these turbulent times. And the tall Viscount with a thick, brush-like mustache nodded briefly, understanding his reasoning. He bowed politely and admitted that he had thought too superficially of the young count. Then, with animal fury, so that no one would think he was joking, he warned Kraut that if he did not serve the heir properly, he would be gutted like a hare on the hunt. But the knight, puffed up with pride and praise from Callias, was fearless, and cheerfully replied that there was nothing to worry about, for which he deservedly received a blow with a steel sledgehammer, which is exactly how the Viscount's fist felt. Then, without changing his tone, Russell addressed the army with an appeal. Despite the fact that the young count had not yet recovered from his wounds, he had nevertheless planned a campaign in which he himself volunteered to participate. The Viscount began, and everyone stood at attention, listening to him. Therefore, everyone is obliged to follow him and serve him valiantly and conscientiously, as befits a warrior. And the army of young men answered in unison, yes. But Callias's watchful eye did not fail to notice that among the brave men who had set out with him on this dangerous campaign, few had any respect for the young count, who had recently attempted to take his own life. He shifted his gaze to another figure wrapped in a woolen cloak, not to protect himself from the cold, but to hide his face. The hem of the cloak curved slightly, and in the glare of the lanterns and the moon, Lyra's white and beautiful face flashed beneath it. Later, Kraut stared for a long time into the empty, seemingly non-existent bottom of the well. It reeked of cold and dampness, and a narrow rope ladder stretched down into it. Gritting his teeth, the knight slowly descended. He muttered that the heir should also be careful, and the count followed him down. Reaching the bottom, Kraut warned that the passage was long, and it would take a long time to walk through, and lit the hatch that led outside the castle with his lantern. Callias ordered them to move. His army of not-so-loyal and devoted warriors followed him. They walked cautiously, splashing through puddles and lighting their way with oil lanterns, until Kraut stopped and announced to everyone that they had arrived. Callias was breathing heavily. His body was not accustomed to long walks through narrow passages, where even he sometimes had to bend over. A heavy bronze door with a rotary valve led to the entrance. Iron would have rusted solid in this dampness long ago. On the other side, the same rope ladder awaited them, and Kraut offered his hand to the count, who did not refuse. And so they looked out into some kind of dilapidated shack, where clearly no one had lived for several decades. An abandoned watermill, Kraut explained, and opened the creaky gate. Callias let out a sigh of admiration when he stepped outside. Outside, a well-equipped wagon train was waiting for them, several loaded carts drawn by horses. Kraut showed him his place in the wagon. The count sharply reminded the simpleton to stop calling him sir outside the castle, as they were traveling through enemy territory, and anyone who recognized him as the heir to the county would gladly serve Viscount Koscherin and free him from his troubles. He ordered him to address him simply by his fictitious name. To conceal their departure, they left at night, dressed as merchants, but few behaved naturally in unfamiliar clothes. Callias called his bodyguard again. He asked if all his orders had been carried out, and the knight nodded but hesitated to answer. Then, taking out a patched-up rag, he asked with disgust if he really had to travel in it with a bunch of fleas and lice. Seeing his expression, Callias immediately offered to dress him in sackcloth and take on the role of Lyra's husband. The bodyguard readily agreed, and again called him a count, forgetting his secrecy, for he could not allow him to sit next to a murderer. Lyra, who was hiding her face under a wide woolen cloak, remained silent. Many looked at her suspiciously after the guard's words, and Callias grimaced with anger, for sometimes only idiotic allies are worse than treacherous enemies. The sluggard resolutely walked past him, although he did so reluctantly, but he still reached out his hand to Lyra, addressing her as lady. The girl boldly knocked his paw away and told the slave not to bring any ladies into this, and Callias wondered again if they would be able to leave their lands without the lowest dog finding out about it. Kraut took a long time to recover from what he had heard. Then he was overcome with terrible anger. He had disliked this girl from the moment they first met. The same could be said about Lyra. If those who serve under the same master get along well, they strengthen each other. But it could also be the other way around, and then constant squabbles and quarrels are inevitable until one of them dies or leaves of their own accord. The hero's fate was a game, but whether it was created by the devil or God, he knew very well what people were like, thought Callias. He could only hope that Lyra herself understood that only she could convince everyone of her usefulness. The count was thinking about helping the former spy, now his mercenary, a little when Kraut reported that everything was ready. Now, while the sun had not yet risen, they had to get as far away from the castle as possible, and his young page began to carry out the order and rouse the men. They walked slowly, driving their horses along the road in a long line, lighting their way with lanterns. They stopped for a rest only in the evening of the next day. Then they set off again. Passing through small towns, Kraut bought food supplies. Callias sometimes decided to talk to people, but he always wore his red cloak. The village they passed through during the day was the last peaceful haven, beyond which lay only an unpredictable sea of dangers, Kraut told him, as they sat down to warm themselves by the fire. There was no longer any need for disguise. Tomorrow they would have to fight, replied the young count, and he gazed for a long time at the cold, clear sky dotted with stars unfamiliar to him. Early in the morning, when the last embers had not yet died out in the fire pit and the stars were still visible in the twilight, they were all up. Now the most interesting part will begin, the count told them, and he led his small army forward, now no longer the merchant's servants, but true knights and warriors, clad in chainmail and armed with weapons. Later, Callias moved to the wagon train and rode on the box of one of the carts. Kraut looked into the distance and squinted. Then he reported that the scout they had sent ahead had returned. He warned them that there was a pack of forest snow monsters ahead. Kraut immediately asked how many and received the answer 5, which was a lot for their army. But then the young count called out to him. He demanded to be carried on his back so he could see everything with his own eyes. A cheeky grin appeared on the bodyguard's face. He picked up the feather-light count and carried him like a faithful horse. They climbed a tall tree with a better view. The forest monsters lived in a tribe in an open clearing where there were several huts with smoke coming from them. They looked like monkeys, but unlike humans, they were much larger and more dangerous. Callias asked the knight what their plan was. First, they had to block the escape routes with fire arrows, Kraut began, but the young count immediately cut him off, lest the madman set the forest on fire. Lyra waited patiently for them below. Kraut responded coldly and knowledgeably. After all, war was his main specialty, and he needed to save the lives of his men. They couldn't act rashly. Callias fell silent, feeling like an owl as they stood on the wind-swaying spruce tree. There was no one in the whole world who knew monsters better than the young count, but he could hardly convince his people of that. Kraut jumped down and landed softly, miraculously avoiding tearing his meniscus, and added that he would not set fire to the forest but would act according to his plan. And Callias realized that even if he could convince his knight, it was not certain that others would believe him. All this time, Lyra had been listening to their conversation, hiding behind a tree. Without saying another word, Kraut went to tell everyone about his plan. Although, to the young count's horror, there was no sign of any particular strategy. Now that he had no authority, he was simply a burden to his people, and the forest watched him intently with two brown eyes, as if probing and waiting to see what the young count would show in this endeavor. Watching the people prepare for battle, the count promised himself to do everything possible to prove himself. Then he returned to the cart, consumed by his thoughts. He fixed his cold gaze on the source of the footsteps. Lyra came to tell him something, and threw back the hood of her cloak. She was worried that Kraut's plan would most likely fail, and that everyone who took part in it would die. And she said this not because she wanted to annoy the soldier. Of course, that would only happen if the count himself did not risk his life and save his people. Callias shuddered at her words. He knew this very well himself. Lyra was surprised by his inaction and calmness in such a situation. The count grimaced and said that he was just thinking about how to lead his people personally, so that they would obey him unquestioningly. And he had an idea. Lyra wanted to believe in him without hesitation. There was something about this young man and his confidence. There was no fear in his light blue eyes that reflected the sky. Lyra knew that in case of any danger, the females would grab their young and run away, while the males fought fiercely to protect them. And once their lives were safe, the warriors of the tribe would begin to take revenge and pursue their enemies in every way possible. Callias took a deep breath, not hiding his annoyance, and asked Lyra what she thought about it. The spy was surprised that the count was asking her opinion, and replied that there was something she wanted to be sure about. Ultimately, they didn't need to kill the monsters, but simply pass them by. Callias nodded. Unlike Kraut, the spy was able to think flexibly. She already had a plan, the goal of which was to make the monsters feel that their refuge was not so safe. At the moment, the path was blocked by a group of 5 monsters, which would soon be attacked by the self-sacrificing fool Kraut. For the plan to work, the second squad must attack the females and draw their attention, which will force the tribe's warriors to retreat. Callias nodded briefly again, without even looking at the spy. He had already been considering a similar plan, but there was a nuance to it. The key point is who will attack from ambush and risk themselves for the sake of the others, he asked, giving the girl a cold look. The monsters would instantly fly into a rage and pursue the attacker to the ends of the earth. Such a mission is pure suicide, Callias said menacingly. But unexpectedly, he heard in response, "I'll go." From the very beginning, Lyra understood who would carry out this plan. Callias' eyes flashed with the blue of the sky. Could it be that she had the temptation of a siren, he asked. Now it was Lyra's turn to be taken aback by surprise. The count easily guessed her plan, because this girl would never agree to risk herself without being sure of success. And he knew that this herb would deceive the monster's keen sense of smell. Surprised by his insight, Lyra honestly admitted that she had been watching him for a long time, and that he was not at all like the child he used to be. The count's cough suddenly worsened, and he quickly agreed to Lyra's plan, knowing that he had a chance of success. Fortunately, the spy decided to keep her suspicions to herself until better times. Pounding her chest, the spy assured him that there was nothing to worry about, as she had been walking around these lands for 8 years, just like in her own garden, so everything would go smoothly. Such zeal could not fail to arouse the young count's suspicion. Why was she trying so hard for their success? But for Lyra, it all made sense. If the Shaken family was destroyed, she too would be in danger as a renegade. It sounded logical, and the count had nothing to say in response at that moment. Still, he asked the spy if she was prepared for others not to recognize her achievements. The girl thought for a moment, and Callias stood up. Lyra waited obediently for him to speak. The count suddenly pointed his finger into the distance. When enemies attack, there will always be 1 or 2 more than in the immediate vicinity. A group of knights could be threatened by an attack from behind, the girl said excitedly. and Callias agreed with her. Monsters usually did that. He pointed out a couple more places to her, and asked what she thought of them, like a teacher during an exam. Perhaps there is a goblin village there, the spy suggested, since they were the monkey's favorite food. Callias praised her for her excellent answer. Now he himself understood that he did not want to go that way at all. Lyra bowed, assuming that Callias would instruct the knights to defend this place. Then the Count turned to his scout with a request. At that moment, Kraut noticed his master talking to the spy about something. After listening to the Count, Lyra laughed heartily, which she did not do often. At that moment, she looked like a normal, sweet girl, so Callias lingered on her with his gaze. Their eyes met. Then she reached out her hand to his face. Her warm, slightly rough palm touched his cheek, but with such tenderness that the touch was pleasant. Unexpectedly, Callias found her thin cherry lips incredibly attractive and so close that he could feel her breath. Without realizing it, the young Count blushed and recoiled slightly. Callias closed his eyes because he suddenly felt extremely vulnerable, with no defense against this type of attack. But Lyra had already removed her hand, saying that there was a leaf on his face, and she laughed again, as if nothing had happened. The Count couldn't believe that a simple leaf had made him tremble like a reed in the wind. Now he understood better why people rushed to get an autograph from their favorite actor. Kraut suddenly interrupted their pleasant conversation. He casually asked the Count if he needed anything. Callias nervously, almost sending his bodyguard to pick up the pieces, shouted that he didn't want anything. Then he ordered Kraut to prepare armor for Lyra. The bodyguard stared at him in surprise. Callias said that she would have a special assignment, and the bodyguard looked at the spy suspiciously. He still didn't trust her, and asked the Count what kind of mission it was. The young Count condescendingly asked him to trust his decisions, because they were all in the same boat now. Kraut snorted and said stiffly that he would believe this spy just this once. Meanwhile, Lyra took off her cloak and asked the knight not to bother, as she had prepared her armor in advance, and immediately caught several interested glances. It was difficult to call the garment she was wearing armor, because it looked more like a swimsuit that tightly hugged all her appetizing curves and left the girl's long legs exposed. +5 to the morale of all troops, Callias read the message from the system. The sight took the breath away from the young men who had yet to taste battle. Meanwhile, Lyra elegantly adjusted her long sleeves and greaves. Then she turned to Callias and announced that she was ready. Someone whistled softly as they looked at the parts of her body that were not protected by armor. A jar of ointment appeared in the scout's hands. She applied it to mask her own scent and the smell of metal and leather from which her armor was made. For some time, Lyra carefully covered herself with the ointment. The smell was so strong that it knocked you off your feet like a horse's hoof, and Kraut even covered his nose, unaccustomed to it. Lyra's gaze changed as she checked her knives. She pulled them out sharply several times and returned them to their sheaths. Callias watched all the preparations with great pleasure. Then he gave the order to begin. He suggested that the scout take a few soldiers with her for protection, but she calmly refused, knowing that no one would obey her orders anyway. They exchanged one last glance. There was nothing more to say. Then, with the agility of a squirrel, Lyra jumped onto a tree and disappeared from view. Kraut nodded and turned around too. They were ready to go. A small group of knights moved forward. Kraut walked in front as the strongest warrior in the squad. They entered without hiding. The wind was blowing toward the village of the snow monkeys, so they would soon smell them. Lyra headed downwind, but looking at her back, Callias would learn nothing. So he turned his gaze to the knights. The monkeys smelled the enemies and became alarmed. Kraut struck first, swinging his long sword from a running start. He immediately realized that the blow was too weak. It was a rash move, because the first strike should have hit the vulnerable points. The monkey easily dodged and immediately counterattacked the hapless knight. There was a loud crash, and everything was covered in smoke. But Kraut was still standing firmly on his feet. Somehow, he had managed to defend himself. Graf exclaimed with delight. It was one thing to watch everything on a monitor screen, but quite another to enjoy the fight live. The monkey began to beat its chest to raise the alarm and scare off the intruder who had invaded their territory. Several warriors from the tribe immediately came out to meet the danger. Seeing their numbers, Callias thought that the plan to set the forest on fire might not be so bad after all. Then Kraut rallied the rest of the Blue Lion Knights to battle. The young count became nervous, sensing the worst. The two knights who stood before him introduced themselves. The one in the cloak was called Thomas, and the other in armor was called Alba. Meanwhile, a whole horde of terrifying monsters was rapidly approaching them. Then Kraut used a powerful technique. His sword filled with an aura and flashed with bolts of lightning. The bolts flew from his sword like drops of liquid flame. There was an explosion and a crash, and debris flew through the air. The noise was so loud that even Callias, who was standing behind him, felt his ears pop. Everything was covered in smoke and dust. And then he caught a glimpse of the huge monkey carcass falling. Turning around, Kraut couldn't help but smile smugly. What carelessness during battle, thought the young count indignantly, looking at his bodyguard's smirk. And no wonder, because the battle continued, and the snow monkey tribe still had many warriors. One of the monsters was attacking another knight. From the powerful blow, he lost his sword and turned around in horror, looking at it, regretting that he had not brought his usual long spear or halberd for fighting a large opponent. In horror, the soldier rushed for his toothpick when the monster's shadow was already looming over him. To save his comrade, Kraut engaged in hand-to-hand combat, forgetting that he himself had a weapon in his hands, but he saved his friend. He shouted at him to grab his sword quickly. The monkey, which had received a precise blow to the eye, recoiled in shock. Kraut went on the offensive, rushing to deliver a couple more blows to the monkey. The monster came to its senses and swung its long spear at the soldiers. Kraut took advantage of this and cut off the monkey's paw, saving his comrade once again. The monster growled viciously, unable to bear such an insult. The creatures turned out to be much more dangerous and resilient than the knight had thought. Another old monkey lunged at them with his bare hands. Kraut dodged the blow and dove under the monster's arm. He struck it below the knee tendons, aiming to knock the giant down. The monster growled in pain and collapsed to the ground. Seeing another enemy defeated, the soldiers were encouraged. But it took a lot of effort, so now he was breathing heavily. In addition, there were 7 enemies in front of them, whereas before, they had clearly seen 8 carcasses in the camp. And then the last enemy appeared, covered in white fur and flashing with malice. He was larger than the other monsters. He came up behind them and, ignoring the knights, rushed towards the young count. Callias shuddered, regretting that he had not taken better cover. Cursing under his breath, Kraut rushed to his master in horror. One of the knights shielded the count by holding his spear in front of him. To delay the enemy in some way, Kraut attacked from a distance with his thunderous blow. The shockwave from it even reached the place where the young count was standing. A cloud of dust rose and again blocked their view. Instead of taking advantage of the veil and running away, they remained in place because they were immediately attacked. One of Callias' bodyguards was hit. The force of the blow was so great that he flew past the young count, causing him to shudder with horror. The second guy stepped forward, hoping to somehow delay the monkey. Kraut gritted his teeth and got up, gathering his remaining strength. And again he attacked the monkey leader with his thunderous blow. A flash illuminated the faces of Callias and his bodyguard. The count ordered the soldier to help Kraut, which would give them a better chance of survival. But the soldier hesitated, thinking he could hold out a little longer. The young count couldn't take it anymore and yelled at him that no one would come to their aid in time and they had to act. If Thomas delayed, he would have to fight 2 monkeys, said the count, squeezing his hand. Thomas was still hesitant, because Captain Kraut had ordered him not to leave the air. Then the count pressed the young man again, asking if he dared to question his orders. Then Thomas gripped his sword more tightly, for he too had taken a knight's oath to obey his lord's orders. Callias praised him for his quick thinking. He himself hurried to the wounded soldier. The soldier had flown so far that the count was out of breath as he ran. Alba lay on the grass, covered in blood. He looked terrible, to say the least. So the count, unaccustomed to such a sight, gasped. The knight's armor was crumpled like a tin can, and one arm was completely torn off. Callias ran straight to him, shouting for him to stay conscious. He cut the straps holding the cuirass in place and removed it, then poured a potion into the knight's throat. Alba's stomach was swollen from internal bleeding. A low-grade potion would not work. They needed a healer or a better potion. Callias ran again, this time toward their camp. But there were more monkeys in his way. They were ravaging the goblin settlement that Lyra had warned him about. One of the monsters looked around warily and sniffed. In the hands of the monkeys, the goblin was like a rabbit. The monster growled, and Callias trembled at its cry. He waited for the monkey to leave, his heart pounding in his chest. Their plan had worked. Lyra had set a trap and distracted the monsters, but that did not comfort the trembling in his knees. He felt that he could die at any moment, and even the sword of Alba hanging from his belt, which he had picked up, would not save him. The monkey bared its teeth viciously, and Callias was overcome with genuine horror. For the first time, he felt with his own skin what it was like to be in a world where you had to do more than just press buttons. And yet he couldn't let his knight die just like that, so he stepped forward and shouted to attract attention. To give himself determination, he swore loudly. Unable to bear such an insult, the monster lunged at him. Callias pulled the rope, and in that instant, dozens of sharp stakes pierced the monkey's back almost through and through. Therefore, before reaching the count, the monster fell, and hot blood spurted from the wounds on its body. But then another monster jumped out of the bushes. It caught Callias off guard. The young count barely managed to dodge the heavy blow with his frail body. Fortunately, there was another string nearby that triggered a trap. A trap net began to fall on the monkey from above. It was woven from strong, thorny vines, so it caught the monster immediately. The thorns caused the monkey unbearable pain, and they were also coated with the temptation of a siren. In addition to hiding odors well, this ointment also had a soporific effect. Now the Count could approach the monster without worry, and everything went smoothly. He took out the sword of the Knight Alba, which he had borrowed. He struck a blow, albeit a weak one, but it was aimed directly at the head. Callias felt the crunch of bones as his sword pierced the skull. When he pulled out the blade, he was splashed with a fountain of blood. The foul smell instantly made him dizzy and he felt nauseous. He had never had to kill before. He had not even served in the army, so he felt strange. Taking someone's life with your own hands is not an easy thing, thought the young Count. The strength of the slain monster was equal to that of a fourth-class knight, so the Count had something to be proud of. But an old enemy of the monkeys he had just killed jumped at him from a tree. He would surely have died from such a blow. But then the wounded Albi put his back to the Count and covered him with his body. Callias rolled across the ground from the impact. A small goblin with rabbit ears and evil eyes stared at him, holding a serious dagger in its paws. Callias glanced at the knight next to him and felt nauseous again. In addition to the soldier's other injuries, there was a long wound across his back. Filled with bitterness and regret, Callias lost his mind and rushed at the little troublemaker. He swung his sword clumsily, and it whistled over the dwarf's head. The Count struck again and knocked the goblin off his feet. Although he himself was weak, he fought fiercely, and the green-skinned creature was not the most difficult opponent. But he was not lacking in agility, and even with a short dagger, the goblin nearly slashed the Count's stomach. He was lucky that the goblin had short arms, otherwise it would have ended in a funeral. The Count's body was too weak, and after a couple of swings, his arms trembled as if from a chill. Nevertheless, he still felt confident. His sword and long arms gave him greater distance and compensated for his lack of strength and speed. If he acted cautiously, he should be able to deal with this enemy. However, the short man surprised him by attacking from above with a sharp lunge, without fear of a counterattack. Callias did not turn away and struck back while his opponent was in the air. The goblin tried to reach his throat with his dagger, but in the end, both of them spun around and fell to the ground. A little more, and he would have been gushing blood from his neck, but luckily that didn't happen, and Callias was breathing heavily. They got to their feet at the same time, but the goblin attacked first again. The green-skinned creature deftly dodged the predictable sword attack. He moved closer to Callias's side, aiming his dagger at his head. Then the young Count used his foot to strike the goblin's thin forearm, and the goblin lost his weapon. And then, when the enemy was unarmed, Callias wished him a good journey to hell, or whatever awaits monsters after death. The goblin screamed in agony, but it was too late. The Count's sword pierced him through to the hilt and pinned him firmly to the tree. The clean mountain air tore at his throat, and Callias barely managed to keep himself from falling down exhausted. Then he looked at the weakest of the monsters, who hung pinned to the tree like a butterfly. Now he felt a strange emptiness inside. Then he looked at his trembling, bloodied hands. He remembered the feeling of pierced flesh and the death throes of the goblin, which was so much like a human, and the Count felt sick right there on the spot. He had just fought a battle to the death and won, and the realization dawned on him. Then a system message appeared, informing him that he was entitled to a reward for killing monsters, although it had been reduced for using traps and poison. However, he had defeated the goblin with his own hands, so he was rewarded with access to the inventory and a level increase from 8 to 11. Then Kraut ran up to him and called out to his master. He was stunned when he looked around the field and realized that a battle had taken place here. In horror, the knight began to examine the Count for wounds and other injuries, but found nothing except a couple of abrasions and bruises. After the knight killed 2 monkeys, the rest retreated, so his battle ended well. Of course, it wasn't just luck. Lyra had successfully distracted the tribe's warriors, and then he remembered something he had completely forgotten in the heat of battle. The wounded knight, who had twice shielded him with his body during the fight, still needed help. Callias ordered him to find him immediately, and Kraut pointed his finger, easily seeing where their comrade was lying. When he organized this sortie, he did not think that he would suffer losses in the very first battle. Callias bent over the dead soldier and blamed himself for not noticing the enemy in time. The knights waited. The death of their comrade was also taken hard by them. Everyone understood that their mission was very risky, and the Count should not blame himself so much. But the young Count suddenly exclaimed angrily that it was all self-deception. Death is just death, and honor no longer matters, he said. Kraut lowered his gaze. He too had lost a subordinate for the first time and did not know what to say. And then the Count felt a lump in his throat again. 3 more dead men from Kraut's squad were laid on the ground, already wrapped in white sheets. 3 dead, 11 slightly wounded. Minimal damage considering their opponents, said the knight. These men died because of him, Callias realized. If only he had used his knowledge and talked them out of it. they would have lived. Only the trap that Lyra had set at his request saved his life. But even that plan cost Albie his life. So the Count shouted angrily, or wept over his worthlessness and weakness. He asked Kraut what they did with the bodies of those who died on missions. Usually, they were preserved and returned home if circumstances allowed. Callias ordered him to take care of it. The knight turned to his men to give the order, and he stopped short when he saw how they were barely holding back their tears. The warriors were touched that their lord cared so much about them. Now they were filled with the desire to die for him in battle. Kraut also noticed that their attitude had changed. Finally, they began to trust their lord, whom they had previously treated with indifference. After that, they returned to camp. All preparations were complete, and they were ready to set off again. Awaiting only his orders, Kraut reported to his master. Callias glanced at the soldiers. Despite their losses, their fighting spirit was high. After all, they had won the battle, albeit at a great cost. Callias himself noticed that they now looked at him differently. Here were his knights, ready to go to war and die at a moment's notice. Now was not the time to fall into depression because of guilt, so the Count decided to instill even more confidence in them, and addressed them with an appeal. The battle had been difficult, and now they had to get to their destination as soon as possible. However, they must not forget their wounded comrades, the Count added, declaring that he would never allow them to abandon them in their time of need. Everyone shouted in unison, which further strengthened their fighting spirit. An hour ago, Lyra was making her way through the thick pine forest. She walked skillfully and silently behind the monsters, when suddenly, one of the monkeys lunged at her. But the scout had enough speed and agility to dodge the throw. She threw her blade on a leash. It stuck firmly into the tree, and now Lyra had a foothold for quick movement. She deftly dodged the monster chasing her again, and found herself in a tree out of its reach. Jumping quickly from branch to branch like a squirrel, Lyra set up a sling on the tree. Then she climbed back down to the ground. The girl stood up and looked at the beast rushing toward her. The huge monkey glared at her ferociously, and threatened to tear her to pieces if it caught her. But then the monkey ran into the fishing line that Lyra had stretched across its path, and it painfully cut into its throat. That's it, thought the scout, rejoicing that everything had worked out. The huge monkey hung limply on the thin rope. However, it then returned and broke the wooden trunks on which the fishing line was stretched. And Lyra shuddered, realizing that her trap had been bypassed, and the monster was already reaching out its grasping paws toward her. The scout deftly jumped forward and dodged the blow, once again pulling out her dagger on a leash. Lyra moved quickly so the monkey couldn't keep up with her. With skillful movements, she wound the fishing line around the monkey's neck several times. Then she pulled it tight with all her might, causing the monster to cry out in pain as it gasped for air. The monkey was immobilized again. Lyra hoped that this time everything had worked out, although she still had her doubts. The line was so thin that it was unlikely the monkey could pick it up with its hands. Despite the suffocating grip, the monster still resisted, even though it was useless. However, under the weight of the monster's carcass, the trees creaked, and the thin line began to pull on the trunks. The brave scout reached behind her back. There, where she had a dagger, just in case, the monkey dug its paws into the ground and pressed even harder. Its huge hands stretched out toward the girl, threatening to crush her. Lyra clenched the long, thin awl in her hand tighter and prepared for the blow. Then she swung it. The awl was hollow, like a tube, and the handle contained a sleeping potion. Stabbing the needle into its neck, the girl injected its contents into the monkey's bloodstream. Now all that remained was to wait. She still didn't know if this trick would work or not. She would have to see for herself if Callias was right. But the monkey refused to give up its life so easily and let out a terrible scream despite its constricted throat. The thin trunks could not withstand the impact and broke. Then the scout was terrified because she felt danger again. But then the monster's scream died away when the air ran out in its lungs. Only then did the monster lose consciousness and finally collapse. Until the very end, Lyra did not believe that it would work. Reluctantly, she had to admit that Callias knew more about poisons than she did. In just one night, this guy had changed so much. For a whole year, the spy had been watching the heir to the county, but now he had become the complete opposite of himself. Thoughtfully, she wiped the blood from her weapon. Who knows where all this will lead? Lyra looked at the tall fir trees swaying in the wind as if trying to grab the sky. Meanwhile, Callias returned to camp and was now looking at their modest army from his carriage. The absurd battle had cost them 4 fighters. Many were wounded and exhausted, and despite the soldiers' zeal, it was unlikely that another such battle could be expected. And yet they did not complain and accepted their fate with fortitude. Callias gave the order to take a short break. Kraut nodded and passed the order down the chain, from one soldier to another. Now, even a normal march was a great challenge for them, as the wounded forced the healthy to expend more energy and put themselves at risk of what could turn into a real disaster. Therefore, the young count gave them potions and told them to drink them to avoid this. The soldiers immediately became excited, realizing the value of these items and that they still had a long way to go. But Callias ordered them not to argue and to quickly empty the bottles. But then Kraut noticed his actions and asked what the count was doing, to which Callias grumbled discontentedly that nothing but trouble followed him. The bodyguard duly reprimanded the count for using potions intended for himself. 10 vials were taken from the supplies of the old, now deceased count, Kraut grumbled. But Callias sharply rejected his words, saying that they had wounded soldiers who needed help, and now was not the time to worry about potions. The bodyguard immediately stopped and fell silent. The wounded soldiers stared at their commander in surprise. Seeing that everyone was tense, the young count softened and told the knight to calm down. He promised that if they succeeded, they would drink such potions like water. And Kraut nodded. And then they both gasped and froze. The soldiers bowed low, paying tribute to the young count who, like them, spared no effort. Every knight must swear allegiance to his lord, but only occasionally can they truly be satisfied with whom they serve, thought Kraut. And now was just such a moment. The young count was embarrassed by this expression on his face, and ordered the captain to hurry up and get ready to leave, as it was time to move on. Then he returned to his carriage. But then a system message caught his attention. The young lord's reputation had grown by a full 4%, and the situation had shifted from the deadlock at the bottom, where the opinion of his own subjects had previously remained. So their small caravan moved on. The road was free of monsters, and Callias looked to the future with hope. They traveled for quite a long time until the young count stopped the column again, which he himself was leading. Kraut approached him to find out what was going on, but Callias had already jumped off the wagon and informed everyone that they had arrived at their destination. And then, without explaining anything, he walked past his knight. There was nothing nearby, as if the place had been completely abandoned. The young count never received any news from Lyra, and then he ordered to set up camp right there. And the tent must be pitched exactly where he was standing, he declared decisively. Half an hour later, the commander's tent was already set up, and they settled comfortably in the area. The count's men knew their business. Callias pointed to a spot on the map and declared that the treasure of the Kosherin clan was located right there. The road to this place was not close to their camp. Kraut was indignant at the count's carelessness, because even according to the map, they still had a week's journey ahead of them, and so far they had been sustained only by their strength of spirit. But the young count only smiled slightly. If they still had a week of such marching ahead of them, not everyone would be able to complete it. Kraut objected again. The mood at the council that Callias had arranged took a sharp turn for the worse, and everyone frowned. One of the knights suggested staying put, and warned that the Viscount's soldiers had probably already found traces of the previous battle, and were now looking for their small detachment. Callias sighed discontentedly, thinking how foolish they were. He stunned the knights by declaring that he had only pointed them to the treasure, but they had no intention of going there. Kraut was so taken aback that he forgot about his master's rank, because the treasure was their goal. Callias stood in the center of the tent and said that they should just go inside and then go to the treasure trove. These words did not explain anything to those present, so they stared at the count in surprise. Unexpectedly, Callias pressed his foot on a stone slab and it sank down. Dust rose and vibrations spread across the surface. Then, like a magical gnome, a stone pillar sprang out of the ground. The knights were startled by this turn of events and grabbed their swords. A honeycomb structure appeared on the surface of the roughly hewn stone, and the count reached out his hand toward it. He pressed something, and the stone sank back into the ground. Kraut even managed to say a prayer, just in case something else happened. But fortunately, it was just a passageway opening, from which a damp and cold breeze blew. While the knights were recovering, Callias himself went ahead, but his loyal bodyguard managed to catch him, because danger could be waiting below, so he declared that he would go first. The young count felt like a child again, and agreed with him, albeit grumbling, because nothing would happen to him anyway. Meanwhile, Crowder was still wondering where the young lord had gotten this valuable information. Callias smiled indulgently. He was no longer the simpleton he used to be, even though it was hard to believe. He certainly would not have embarked on this venture without being confident of success. Despite everything he had heard, the bodyguard was still hesitant. But then another knight stepped forward and firmly declared that he believed his lord. He was ready to go through fire and water for a man who would fight even simple soldiers, and believed that the count had good reason to be confident of success, which meant he could be trusted without hesitation. The other soldiers echoed his words, filling the tent with their cheerful voices full of enthusiasm. Callias froze at such a reaction. Although he was grateful to them, he was still a simple weakling who did not even know how to use mana, the count said with regret. Knight Thomas smiled encouragingly and promised that they would become his new strength. for the Lord had an inner core. However, their captain, Kraut, was more emotional than the others and hid his face so as not to show his manly tears. Then, the young count resolutely appealed to all those present, saying that they still had wounded men fighting for their lives and that time was running out, and his army responded to the call in unison. A ray of sunlight penetrated the tent, as if wanting to peek in on the great deeds being accomplished, while the count watched Kraut's head disappear into the dungeon. Meanwhile, Lyra was resting after the battle, coming to her senses. She collected some monkey blood in a jar. She wiped her blood-stained face. Then she headed for the cave, which smelled bad. A flint appeared in her hands and the scout struck several sparks. After that, she quickly moved. Then she stopped on a branch like a crow, as it was dangerous to move on the ground because the snow monsters were still nearby. However, her main problem was the soldiers in dark green cloaks like her own. Now they were anxiously examining the traces of the battle with the monsters. Apparently, they had been attracted by the noise of the battle, and now they were carefully examining everything, trying to understand what had happened. Lyra's eyes flashed with determination, even though there might be people she knew among these scouts. But in the end, it was every man for himself in this world. The quill pen of one of the soldiers of the county of Koshirin scratched across the paper. There were no bodies of humans or other monsters left at the scene. Someone had taken away their wounded, if there were any. This meant that a tribe of snow monkeys had been defeated here, the scout realized. There was only one force in this region capable of such a thing, apart from their own, he thought as he took notes. He wanted to send this report to Viscount Servio as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Lyra quietly crept up to them, hiding behind the poor wigwams where the snow monkeys lived. She noticed that the scout had sealed the letter with wax and left the imprint of his ring on it. Gauging which way the wind was blowing, the scout moistened her finger with saliva and took out a bottle of snow monkey blood. Then she splashed the contents onto the branches of the wigwams, and again she hid under the branches of tall fir trees, to watch what would happen from a distance. The fire spread quickly, and the wind drove it toward the snow monkey's shelter. The animals instinctively feared fire and panicked at the sight of it. The big white monkey leader growled fiercely and sniffed the air. And then, as if sensing something, they all ran in that direction. The scout ran like a squirrel, jumping from branch to branch, ignoring the thorns that stung his face. Soon their squad would be destroyed, and he had to report this to the Viscount at all costs. But then he seemed to hear the sounds of pursuit and stopped. Hiding in the bushes, he froze, hoping that he had managed to hide well and escape. However, at that very moment, he felt an excess of iron in his body and acute renal failure. He recognized the blade sticking out of his chest and the methods they had used, but it was too late. Lyra sent him on his final flight straight to the ground, after first removing the report from her pocket. But she did not know that a vengeful beast was already on her trail. The knights descended the spiral staircase, lanterns in hand. On the way, Callias told them about the history of this place, which had been the home of a wizard who simply wanted to conduct his research in peace until his death. And no fool would leave dangerous traps in his house. Kraut already realized he was wrong, but his concern as a true bodyguard demanded that he check everything, which he quietly reported to the Count. Callias ran his hand over the smooth wall. They weren't built in the usual way. They were formed by melting soil and stones and then quickly hardening them back into place. Not a single crack or joint. Advanced magic had created an engineering marvel, the work of an 8th-level mage, and if he had wanted to leave a trap here, they would certainly not have passed. Now the loyal bodyguard felt even more foolish for all his precautions. The long descent ended, and at the end of the short room was a spacious hall with a vaulted ceiling supported by columns and a table in the middle. Kraut left Thomas to guard the Count and ordered the others to search the hall. Before they set off, Callias made the knight promise that if they found any healing potions, they would go to the wounded. Then he sat down in a chair as if it were a throne. Thomas asked his master how Viscount Koshirin had discovered these ruins. The Count was not particularly concerned with this question. Perhaps chance had helped their enemies, or perhaps someone had told them about it. Thomas remembered that the Viscount had a crystal ball that was used as a key. Callias explained to him that it was not just a ball, no matter how powerful the magician was. What he created gradually weakened, and not just anyone could maintain this magic. Callias thought about it. Considering the state of this place, he still had to prepare. Then Kraut arrived, carrying a box of potions. As the Count had predicted, it was safe here. He ordered them to immediately tend to the wounded, and the knight did so. Kraut was still worried about the cost of the potions and frowned. Callias understood his feelings, but in their situation in enemy territory, it was not the time to worry about money. In addition, the soldiers found magical items for experiments, jewelry, medicinal herbs, water crystals, and much more. They also found several magical artifacts, but nothing particularly valuable. Callias looked around, hoping that the status would highlight these artifacts for him. One place caught his attention, a section of wall between the columns. The Count wanted to examine it himself, but Kraut ruthlessly stopped him again, insisting that his master not act alone, even after all the checks. Callias nodded, letting him follow protocol. They headed for the wall, knowing that the knight would not listen to him or obey him anyway. The Count began to feel the wall in search of a switch, and when his hand found a small recess, the wall began to part before them. The bright light coming from inside cast long shadows. The place before their eyes looked strange, with light coming from a multitude of screens placed on 3 sides, and a control panel in the middle of the room. Coming closer, they noticed that the screens showed every corner of the entire dungeon. Kraut was very surprised, but in the eyes of the young Count, it was just an ordinary video surveillance room. Then the knight noticed something strange. One of the screens showed a room he had not seen, even though he thought he had explored the entire dungeon. Fake ruins, Callias guessed immediately. Experienced wizards placed fake ruins near the refuge in case some clever thieves got to them, as many people are attracted to these places. Kraut suggested that this was the Kosherin family's vault, and the Count nodded in agreement. Now it was clear why the Count had hoped to get into the vault without breaking in. Callias touched one of the spheres, which was supposed to open the room they needed. Seeing how skillfully the gentleman handled the magical artifacts, the knight noted his talent with surprise. After pressing the lever, a strange sound was heard, and the captain of the knights turned around. He immediately went to check what was happening, following the Count's instructions. He reported that another previously hidden passage had appeared in the wall of the hall. This one led to the fake ruins, Callias told the knight. Finally, they could break into the vault and take the silver that Gerard and Viscount Kosherin had hidden there. Using a control device, Callias examined the interior of the fake ruins, and he found the entrance to a silver mine, which was located right inside the fake ruins. Now it became clear how the Kosherin family had managed to secretly extract silver all this time. There were no people inside at the moment, and the Count assumed that mining was carried out at strictly defined times. It was also logical to assume that the workers did not return from this mine in order to keep everything secret. Thinking about their grim fate, Kraut flew into a rage. Callias smiled maliciously, determined to ensure that the Kosherin family could no longer commit evil deeds. To do this, he needed to render the crystal ball unusable. He changed the security code and connection settings, so that if they destroyed the direct passage, Gerard would never be able to enter the vault again. The young Count also decided to kindly leave the vile merchant a little gift and laughed maliciously again. Having finished all his business, he ordered Kraut to start loading the boxes with silver, and when everyone was done, to install the scroll he had prepared earlier. The knight still did not want to leave his master, as if fearing that demons would suddenly jump out from under the ground, even after all the checks. Finally resigning himself to Callias's will, he nodded obediently, and he hurried to carry out the order. When he disappeared around the corner, the Count stretched relaxed, finally alone. After that, he was able to calmly press another hidden button that opened another secret compartment. A silver hoop appeared before him. In the game, this item did not look so impressive. The Count requested a list of information about this item. It was called the Bracelet of the Great Mage Alchem, and possessed magical properties. As soon as the owner received a fatal wound, his body was covered by a protective barrier for 3 days, although the shield itself could be destroyed by further attacks. And if treatment was not received in time, this would lead to death. Recharging took a week, and the shield could be used 3 times in total. Since he was reborn in a frail and weak body, such an artifact suited him perfectly. It was like getting 3 extra lives, thought Callias, and with that, he could leave the ancient mage's refuge. But then something caught his attention. He saw unusual letters carved into the stone, black and slightly glowing. Lady Hecatria, Callias read, but he couldn't make out anything else. He had heard this name once before in the game. It was the name of the goddess who introduced humans to the magical system. However, there was no place in the game where the young Count was now, and he assumed that this was related to how he had ended up in this world. The Count came closer and touched the inscription, and then he was overcome by a strange excitement. At that moment, Callias was transported to a completely different place, a very unusual one. It resembled one of the sacred relics. Perhaps it was the goddess herself, thought Callias, and then his eye twitched. Annoying, he heard a voice inside him say, and everything inside him tightened. He felt as if someone were drilling into his skull with a drill, insistently trying to get inside. Inhuman! The goddess exclaimed furiously. The flames before her flickered as the hall echoed with her indignant cries. The decision has already been made by the majority, the blue lights told the goddess, but she refused to accept it. As you wish, the lights replied. and an incredible force enveloped the goddess standing in the center of the eye. Under their pressure, she cringed in pain. Callias heard a terrible song that sent shivers down his spine. The flames completely hid the goddess, and for a second, it became quiet. Then her image reappeared and she screamed in agony. The Count nearly lost his mind from this scream. The goddess was rapidly losing her strength, and the flames spoke to her contemptuously. She had already fallen to the level of a demigod, and no longer deserved her estate, they said. From now on, she would be the object of contempt and hatred of the people she loved so much, and together with these insects, she would be driven into a corner where she would meet her death. A malicious voice boomed, and Callias grabbed his head again. When the vision ended, he was breathing heavily and took a long time to recover. He couldn't believe it was over, so he involuntarily glanced around the room, and then a status window appeared that he did not expect at all. After reading the description, Callias was stunned with surprise and opened his mouth wide. He had just received the first fragment of the power of Hecatria, and a skill called the Goddess's Feathered Dagger, which was similar in nature to a grenade launcher. But with each shot, the power decreased by 10%. Usually, skills were ranked by the first letters of the Latin alphabet and were unique, but authority skills were on a completely different level. This ability could be used by 9th-level masters, who were also called demigods. Developing one's own self is the only way to reach the 10th level. Following this, another message appeared. Callias had raised his level, and by absorbing other fragments of power, he could raise his class as well. It seems that the one who sent him to this world was the goddess Hecatria, whose authority-level skills are the only way to wound a god. Most likely, Callias would have to take revenge on the other gods instead of the fallen goddess. Realizing this, he laughed. The young count understood the true purpose of this game, clearly enjoying what was happening. Of course, he understood that they were being manipulated, but he decided to leave that for later and first gather everything useful here. Just then, Kraut called him. He had finished all his business and announced his return. The knight asked the count not to be too surprised when he saw it. As soon as Callias entered the hall, his eyes began to dart around in delight. In just half an hour, they had carried out what seemed like a ton of gold, silver, and other valuables. The coins in the chest were certainly not pure gold. Otherwise, the two men would not have been able to lift it, which meant that Viscount Kosherin was not honest here, the count realized. But he was still happy with the loot. They got 6 such chests, and the gold could be remelted later, after the dross was removed. Kraut announced that there was mostly silver here, a total of 420 ingots worth several million gold coins. However, it would not be easy for their small detachment to return with all this wealth. The count looked at the loot with satisfaction. They no longer had to worry about the county's debts. He wasn't even concerned about the weight of this treasure trove. After all, thanks to the battle with the goblin, he had gained access to the inventory. Finally, he had the opportunity to use it, and the count smiled, catching the knight's puzzled gaze. He winked at his bodyguard and ordered all the boxes to be placed in one place. It was quite a sight to behold as the boxes filled the entire hall, even when stacked tightly. The count ordered everyone to prepare to leave this place. Kraut looked puzzled again, not understanding what his master had in mind. In this world, no one but him had the privileges of a player, in the form of skills and inventory, so that people would hardly understand even if everything was explained to them, thought Callias. So now he needed to somehow get everyone to understand. When all the soldiers left the mage's shelter, Kraut asked him what they would do with the boxes. Then Callias showed him the protective bracelet and said that it had a spatial pocket, a first-class artifact, inside which the entire treasury could be placed. The knight's eyes bulged so much that they almost popped out of their sockets. He could not have imagined that such artifacts existed, but the count immediately warned him that this must be kept secret, and the knight shook his head vigorously, making it clear that he would take it to his grave. Callias thanked him and turned back to the loot. As soon as he looked at an object, a status window appeared. Then it could be moved to the inventory, just like in the game. Each item even had its own icon. Then, with a few simple manipulations, Callias dragged everything into his inventory, resembling a sorcerer waving his arms. And again he smiled, enjoying the success for which soldiers had given their lives and shed blood and sweat. The path to the top is never easy, and always comes at a high price, he thought as he climbed upward. The bright sunlight hurt his eyes, and it took him a while to get used to it. Kraut lined up his soldiers and reported that they were ready to depart. The count looked around in surprise. His scout had not yet returned. He was alarmed, even though quite a bit of time had passed. The knight immediately recalled his suspicions, deciding that the girl must have run away. But Callias only gave him a stern look. "Does he still think that the retreat of the snow monsters was an accident?" the young count asked the knight. and the bodyguard involuntarily stood at attention. Then Callias told him everything. Upon learning that the brave girl had thrown herself into the monster's lair, Kraut was horrified. He was overcome with shame for his distrust, and immediately declared that he did not want her to die. And the Count reminded the knight that he had given such an order to Lyra only because he had refused to follow his instructions, and had himself entered into a battle he could not win. Then, for safety reasons, he decided not to use untested tactics, because it was 100 times better to rush bareheaded with swords against huge monsters. Looking back, Kraut realized that the Count was right and bit his lip. If Lyra didn't return, something had happened to her, Callias told them. Thanks to this girl, they got off with minor casualties last time, so now it was their turn to help her. He demanded an answer loudly, so that the soldiers flinched. And then, imitating their captain well, they all answered so precisely that it was their duty to follow their master to the ends of the earth, so loudly that the Count's ears even rang from their shouting. Despite his success, Callias still considered himself pathetic, because he had done nothing during the entire campaign, and had only hidden behind his men. Kraut felt the same way, and now he was eager to fulfill his duty as a knight to somehow ease his guilt. The Count ordered the fastest soldiers to be taken, while the rest were to hide in the basement and wait until they found Lyra. Based on his experience with Lyra, two things could have happened. Either she had met the monkey leader, or she was being pursued by her former master's men. However, it was most likely the leader. Otherwise, the troops of the Viscount of Kosharin would have already appeared before them. Moreover, they would have noticed the surveillance, and Lyra would have covered her tracks without doing anything careless that could lead them to her. The question was how to find her quickly, the Count wondered as his men discussed among themselves. Kraut approached him and asked what he was going to do now. Go to the boss of the snow monsters and, of course, take revenge on him, replied the Count with a malicious smile. He gave the knight a bag of herbs and told him to put them in oil, boil them, and coat his weapons with the mixture. And when the knight began asking ridiculous questions again, he pressured him to just do everything in silence. And Kraut immediately stopped. Callias hoped that Lyra would wait for him and looked thoughtfully at the sky. When they reached the monster's lair, they stopped. According to his estimates, there should only be females and cubs inside. The males were most likely chasing Lyra, and therefore hunting. We need to get rid of everyone inside. Then the males who went hunting will return, and they will follow Lyra's trail, said the Count ruthlessly. Kraut asked him if everything would be all right, because monkeys were not easy opponents, to which Callias replied with a smirk that he would soon see how good the poison was. And the knight looked at his claymore smeared with poison. Without hesitation, the knights burst into the cave, where a welcoming committee was already waiting for them. Kraut attacked first and led the soldiers behind him. The cave echoed with shouts and the clang of weapons as the battle began. Callias heard the noise and ordered everyone to hide so they could track down the leader. The monkeys, hearing that their females and young were in danger, hurried back to their shelter. In this, they were not much different from humans. Then Callias ordered everyone to follow him. They followed the male's trail. They decided to ignore the small tracks. Lyra could handle such monsters herself. To move faster, Callias climbed onto the knight's back as if it were a horse, and Thomas began to pant for two. Thomas asked him if he liked it, but the Count did not immediately understand what he was talking about. It turned out that the arrogant knight was talking about Lyra, and Callias immediately pointed to his place and ordered him to keep his eyes on the road. Thomas was also impressed by Lyra's bravery in going on such a mission alone. Even though he was a knight, he himself would not have dared to do such a thing. This only means that she also needs them, and only together can they survive, said Callias. The Count had no doubt that in his homeland, Lyra's beauty alone would have been enough to make her a model. But that was not the main reason he kept her close to him. It was more of a pleasant bonus. They really needed each other to survive. The first plot action in the game was the invasion of the Kingdom of Jaipur, and at this time, the most active force would be the Mountain Ranger. At first, Callias thought he was an ordinary volunteer soldier, but perhaps some force, like Viscount Servio, had deliberately raised him. The monkey collapsed onto the cold floor of the cave, and Kraut breathed a sigh of relief, having defeated a dangerous enemy. He himself could not believe his success and looked back at his comrades. They congratulated him on his success, just as their captain had predicted, without a single scratch. Coming to his senses, the knight replied that now was not the time to rest, and that they needed to go after their master. He was the first to rush after him, driven by his innate sense of alarm. During the short time he had served under the young Count, Kraut had come to respect him. When Callias arrived on the scene riding his trusty horse Thomas, he shuddered. Lyra was lying face down on the green grass, surrounded by large, vicious wolves that had come to feast on easy prey. Thomas dropped the Count off at the scout and rushed to drive away the predators with either his sword or his saber. They were far from being as skilled as monkeys, so the experienced knight quickly cut off their heads. The Count examined the girl. Her cloak and armor swimsuit were torn, and the fight had badly battered the scout. Callias felt a pang of guilt and regret and pulled a healing potion from his inventory, hoping it would help. He poured a little onto the wound, then poured it directly into her throat, and a warm light surrounded the girl's body. The external wounds closed and stopped bleeding. At least the scout was alive, and Callias could breathe a sigh of relief. The wounds would heal on their own, but in order for Lyra to return to duty, she would need another potion. Thomas returned and reported that he had driven away all the wolves, so the Count asked him to turn the girl over. He poured a little more potion into her throat. They were delighted when they saw a blush appear on the victim's cheeks. Then Kraut caught up with them, glad that no one had been hurt in his absence. The Count realized that the knights had succeeded, and his plan had worked. A week later, they returned to their ancestral castle, the sky above which was blue and clear. The young Count wasted no time and began to strengthen his body with morning runs. Callias had already reached level 18, which was a pretty good result. Because an adult man with average skills could reach level 20, for a 15-year-old boy, that was quite something. Russell noted with pleasure that even though the boy had only recently started training, his growth was impressive, and apparently, his body was not as simple as they thought. Kraut agreed with him. Now Callias looked much better than when they were on the march, as if he had secretly eaten something. Russell gave the knight a slap just in case, so he wouldn't relax. Callias felt that the next level was just around the corner and was already looking forward to that moment. As soon as the young Count fully recovered his body, he would be able to resume his fencing training, the Viscount decided. Meanwhile, Callias finished his training and still had business to attend to in the magic tower. He dried himself with a towel and told Kraut to get ready to leave while he took a bath. This time, there were no unnecessary questions, and Russell noted that the knight had begun to trust his master more. Even after everything that had happened, the young Count remained an enigma to his bodyguard. But one thing Kraut could say for sure was that his master was an incredible person. An heir who cared about the people who served him. Someone you wanted to serve without reservation. Russell nodded thoughtfully. Before, he had to take care of the boy like a nanny, but now he could only watch. He still needed a teacher, and the Count's influence was still small, Kraut noted. Callias was only 15. He had not yet officially come into his inheritance, and was soon to undergo the coming-of-age ceremony. With such rapid growth, no problems are foreseeable, the knight added to the Viscount's words. When Count Colin died, the Viscount felt dark clouds gathering over them, and he did not expect someone worthy to replace him so quickly. The lion cub was also a lion, albeit a small one. The magical tower resembled a lighthouse standing alone in the middle of the Shaken County lands. Inside, it had a long spiral staircase, and all the walls were lined with bookshelves, a collection that was impressive even by modern standards. The Count and his faithful bodyguard dog entered. The door was opened by a young woman wearing glasses, who was very surprised to see her guests. She immediately exclaimed joyfully and, with a blush on her cheeks, grabbed the Count's hand, inviting him to enter. The enchantress chattered incessantly about how happy she was to see a young and handsome man in her home. Seeing them standing there bewildered on the threshold, she dragged them inside and sat them down next to her. Magicians always lived by their own rules. They did not care about a person's social status, and they treated everyone as equals, which often annoyed the haughty nobles. "Would you like some tea?" sang the sorceress and waved her hand. At her command, the tea set danced as if it were alive. Both boys were delighted by such a casual display. Callias took off his red cloak and watched the sorceress's movements intently. The sorceress barely touched the pot-bellied teapot, and steam began to rise from its spout. "It's amazing that a fifth-class magician lives in such a backwater," thought the young Count, and looked even more closely at the sorceress's face. Rosanna the Dreamer, a dreamy girl, her status read. She was still recovering from a stab wound to the chest, and despite her 5th-level power, she had a modest fame and reputation. The sorceress noticed his intense gaze and asked what he was so surprised about, and Callias shared with her that he did not expect to see such talent in their county, and that her gestures were so refined and elegant. Kraut was also impressed by the young Count's ability to behave with women. "If someone can heat a kettle so quickly, then his class is no lower than 5th, Callias declared. "And that means the sorceress herself is no less than a student of the Master of the Magic Tower," he added, and winked slyly. "And she's only 20 years old." Of course, thanks to his status, he knew she was 32. But why not flatter a beautiful woman before offering her a deal? Especially since the sorceress liked such words and was in no hurry to correct him. Kraut, on the other hand, was quick to jump in with his comments and deserved a painful pinch. Rosanna laughed heartily and admitted that she was indeed in her early 20s, and that she was indeed the master's apprentice. Callias immediately feigned genuine surprise and asked her to share the secret of her youth. Rosalina modestly replied that she did nothing special, just slept a lot and washed her face often. Over a cup of tea, the conversation flowed so easily and naturally that they didn't notice how time flew by. Then Rosalina came to her senses and asked her guests what they had come to see her for. Kraut almost choked. He could barely keep up with the stream of carefully calculated flattery. The scroll of the explosion, that was his goal. The Count announced that he wanted to purchase it. Rosalind exclaimed in surprise. She was delighted to have such a valuable customer. Callias also smiled contentedly. 30 scrolls cost only 600 gold pieces, but she always gave handsome young men a discount and agreed to sell them for 500, said the sorceress. At least nature had not deprived him of something, and his good looks had already brought him benefits, thought the Count. Rosalind also told them that they needn't worry about their reputation, as this deal would have no effect on the magic tower. Then Callias moved on to his second request, and Rosalind asked him to name it. Putting on an innocent face and looking at her with eyes as clear as the sky, Callias said that he would like to borrow a little money. A mere trifle. Rosalind's mood immediately darkened. She hastened to ask how much money he was talking about. Only 60,000, the Count said immediately, and the sorceress spit out her tea. She wasn't ready for this, and they froze, waiting for her to say more. However, as collateral, Callias offered her gold and silver in ingots, and promised to pay her interest for using the money. Her eyes flashed behind her glasses, and Rosalind asked what kind of interest she was talking about. A normal loan, but for a short term and monthly interest, said Callias. He couldn't pay Gerard with his own silver, as that would be like admitting to stealing it, so he had to resort to such tricks. Callias's hands were shaking with excitement. He couldn't get such a large sum anywhere else, and the day of debt collection was fast approaching. However, Rosalind said there was a small problem. Callias bit his lip. Had he not earned enough sympathy points, and had he rushed things? The master would hardly allow her to do that, Rosalind said sternly, and the Count clenched his fists at the sound of her voice. However, there was one way. The sorceress immediately softened. The head of the tower is not particularly interested in this place, and it would be good to keep this deal a secret, Rosalind said slyly. This was just what Callias needed, as he couldn't count on banking secrecy. If he didn't repay her debt in 6 months, she would simply sell the gold he had left as collateral, said the sorceress. Now everything was going according to plan, and the Count could relax. Magicians always needed free funds for research, and the interest on 60,000 gold coins was a tasty morsel for Rosalind. Callias bowed low and thanked her for the deal, and Rosalind was also pleased with her acquaintance with the young heir. Now he could face the despicable merchant Gerard without fear, and a malicious grin spread across the Count's face. The merchant himself was furious and ordered a map to be brought to him. He gritted his teeth and fidgeted endlessly on the chair, which had already become unbearably hot beneath him. A whole group of scouts watched over the vault, but it was still emptied. Traces of the missing group remained at this location. Gerard estimated from the map that it would take 10 days to reach the secret vault via this trail. But if you went straight there, it would only take a day. He clenched his fists again in anger and clenched his jaws until it hurt. Then a terrible thought struck him about the intentions of the unknown attackers who had ambushed the scouts, and he decided to go to the storage facility immediately. The sun was setting on the Gorda Plateau, and the dense forest of fir trees only occasionally crackled in the wind. But then the forest of green spears parted, and a stone golem emerged into the clearing. The golem attacked the scouts in their dark green ranger cloaks. The captain of the detachment ordered everyone to calm down. Although this enemy was dangerous, its attacks were predictable, so it was necessary to keep your distance and attack at the right moment. However, when the golem attacked sharply, some soldiers were still not ready for it. They were simply crushed by the monstrous attack, which threw them aside. The rest immediately lost their fighting spirit, since the night-level members of the squad had been defeated so quickly. The monster swung its stone arm again, and another soldier became a wet memory of himself. Someone drew their sword and called for strength, as if that could inspire the fighters in such an unequal battle. His appeal was interrupted and had the opposite effect on the soldiers who were still alive, so another soldier lay down to rest after a hard day. The scouts flinched when they saw another knight being wiped out. Gerard calmly watched as the squad accompanying him was destroyed, and showed no concern about it. But the captain of the knights was completely disheartened, realizing that he would retire earlier than expected, and most likely posthumously. Usually golems do not walk on their own, which means there must be a 5th-level mage nearby who controls them, said the captain of the knights. Turning to Gerard, He said that they had already suffered huge losses and needed to retreat. But Gerard ordered them to stay put, saying that no matter what, he had to send the Marquis the money in 3 days and ordered them to clear the way for him within 24 hours. "And if they fail, they'd better die here," declared the merchant, his face contorted with rage. Meanwhile, in Rosalind's tower, the tea party continued until evening, and Callias wondered to himself whether the recipient had received his gift. The sorceress immediately pricked up her ears, thinking that the gift had romantic undertones. Remembering the vile merchant's terrible intentions, Callias grimaced and replied to the sorceress that he would never do such a thing, to which she replied that she herself would not mind receiving such a gift. Lyra, who heard this proposal from behind the door, immediately bristled. She peeked through the half-open door to see the cunning fox besieging her master. But then Kraut arrived and entered the tower first. He carried everything that was needed to the storeroom of the magic tower and returned, while Lyra, filled with suspicion, followed him. She frowned endlessly on her pretty face. Callias turned to them and thanked Kraut, and then the sorceress handed him a small box. After that, they headed for the luxurious count's carriage with a sense of accomplishment. Lyra asked the knight why the lord was fawning over the sorceress, but Kraut kept his mouth shut so as not to say too much. This only heightened the scout's suspicions, and she looked at the simple-minded knight with the gaze of a killer. "How beautiful!" Rosalind exclaimed, clapping her hands with delight. Callias handed her a gold necklace, a treasure honestly obtained in war. That's how he viewed his raid on Gerard's vault, not as ordinary robbery, and therefore this little thing was worthy of being a gift. "A small token of gratitude for her compliance," Callias said unctuously. He could not have imagined that he would use an artifact found in the ruins in this way. Such gifts fostered trust in their deal, because an official request to the tower would have required a lot of paperwork. Of course, Callias understood that Rosalind simply wanted to keep the interest on the money for herself. So, since the operation was a win-win deal, they were both in good spirits. Just in case, Rosalind asked where the Count was going to use the explosion scrolls, and whether he was going to start a war. Straining, he realized that it was not for nothing that this sorceress occupied her bridge in the magic tower, and gathered information at every opportunity. "Absolutely not," Callias replied immediately with a sincere smile on his face, keeping quiet about the fact that he had no need to start a war that was already underway, albeit undeclared, ever since the attempt on his life. He added that he was simply going to do some excavation work in the mine, which was not far from the truth. Rosalind was surprised because the scrolls were extremely expensive to give away in this way, and she wondered if he had found a gold mine. The Count realized that it was time to reveal the truth and told the sorceress that she would soon find out everything, because they would be seeing each other much more often. His voice was pleasant and friendly, and he carried himself and looked more mature than he actually was, so Rosalind was impressed. His loyal servants waited obediently and patiently outside, their eternal arguments temporarily subsiding. He received 100 scrolls and gathered the funds to pay off the county's debts, and the Count smiled maliciously. Of course, it was difficult to predict the merchant's reaction when he realized he had been robbed. For Viscount Servio, Callias was just a weed in the garden, which is why he ordered him to be killed in cold blood. But no one expected the plan to fail. Now the young Count has no choice but to take revenge, and he will not rest until he has done so. They brought a metal chain in the hope of restraining the huge golem. They drove heavy stakes deep into the ground and attached the chains to them. They tightly bound the monster, restricting its movements. At the ends of the chains were hooks that pulled apart the stone plates covering the golem's core, the source of its power. The strongest warrior in Gerard's squad rushed forward and pierced the core with his sword. The golem exploded and buried several more members of the squad under the stone debris. The battlefield looked depressing. Even though they had destroyed the monster, it could hardly be called a victory. The losses amounted to more than half of the squad, the captain of the knights calculated with horror. But Gerard did not even bother to honor the fallen and demanded that the gate be opened quickly. They approached the heavy gates, which had a hemispherical recess in the middle. One of the servants handed Gerard the key and bowed to him. Although Gerard was not a noble man, no one wanted to anger the hot-tempered lord any further. Gerard snatched the key and placed the ball in the recess. However, a warning call sounded from the depths of the vault, informing them that the key was not the right one and that procedures to intercept the intruder were being initiated. The system helpfully warned everyone that the countdown had begun and that they should move away. Gerard tried again, and the same call repeated everything above. In frustration, he began to pound on the doors with his boot, even though they could not be opened even with a cannon shot. The servant touched his shoulder and suggested that they first go to a safe place and then think about it. When they started to run away, The vault's defense systems activated the first stage of the protocol, summoning all the monsters in the area. And then all the terrifying creatures that inhabited the forest rushed at their already battle-weary squad. Meanwhile, Callias was riding home, enjoying the ride and rejoicing that his battles were behind him, but who knows how many more there would be. But then he encountered another threat. Lyra asked the gentleman when he had learned to use his charm. The Count immediately exclaimed, "Who told you that?" he asked. And why on earth was she asking such questions, as if he had betrayed her or something? Lyra looked angrily out the window, not understanding herself why she was angry. But the Count changed the subject, and his companions waited patiently to hear what he would say this time. Callias asked them what they thought about Gerard's possible betrayal. Lyra was surprised by this assumption. Why would a merchant and moneylender betray Servio, she asked. They began to argue, while Kraut looked from one to the other in bewilderment. Callias believed that Viscount Servio would not forgive Gerard for a mistake that cost them their prosperity. Lyra agreed that her former master was not one to forgive mistakes, and Gerard himself was not one to meekly accept death if the Viscount so desired. And if he realized that the money had been stolen from the vault, he would try with all his might to survive, the Count thought, realizing this. However, Lyra still believed that Gerard would not betray Servio unless absolutely necessary. He cannot be defeated, the young Count agreed thoughtfully and frowned. He's up to something again, flashed through the mind of the scout, who was intently watching the young Count's face. He still felt uncomfortable, as if he was missing something, even after they returned to the shaken family castle. A bloody dawn broke over the Gorda Plateau, bringing no relief to those who had survived the nightmarish night, barely fending off the hordes of monsters at the cost of their entire squad. Gerard, pale with rage, again ordered his servants to quickly open the ill-fated door. He had only one way to do this. Use a magical explosion scroll, which would render the vault useless. But the value of the assets it contained was far more important. A deafening explosion echoed several times off the rocks. When the dust settled, Gerard headed for the gaping hole in the rock. All this time, doubts gnawed at him relentlessly. And not without reason, because when he entered, he saw only an empty hall. His desperate cry and stream of curses echoed in the emptiness. The remaining scouts rushed to explore other halls and corridors, but all they found there were ancient scrolls lying everywhere. One of the servants picked one up and unrolled it, seeing the writing and drawings. But it was not meant to be read, because the scroll immediately burst into bright flames in his hands. The flames of the explosions erupted in a barrage throughout the corridors, and the enclosed environment amplified them many times over, provoking a mountainous impact. Gerard was saved because he remained standing at the entrance, cursing endlessly, not understanding what was happening. When the people came to their senses a little, they noticed that the mine had collapsed and the rubble had buried many of them. This is the end, the merchant realized with ruthless clarity. After this, Viscount Servio would surely finish him off, he realized, and shuddered with fear. These thoughts made the merchant completely dejected and gloomy. So it was time for the backup plan, he thought, and looked at his subordinate. Your homeland will never forget your feat, soldier. Gerard began his solemn speech, but the soldier quickly realized that now was not the time for awards, and before he could move, he became a posthumous hero. It's just how things turned out, apologized the dishonorable merchant. There is no other way to keep everything secret. The captain of the knights grimly noted that the dead man was unlikely to keep his mouth shut. When the Viscount's men noticed something strange in the cave, they would want to investigate it. The die is cast. That's what the backup plan is for, Gerard proclaimed. That evening, rain fell on Viscount Servio's estate, and the sky was completely covered with dark clouds. Gerard remained silent, waiting tensely for his master's response. The latter sat in his chair and watched the rain streaming down the windows. The Viscount was fond of theatrical gestures and was in no hurry to show his face. He moved his finger to indicate that he was ready to listen, and Gerard immediately fell to his knees with a cry. Do not execute me, sire. Regrets are pointless. The Viscount dryly dismissed his cries. He wanted to know what had happened to his money. Gerard assumed that the attack was the work of tomb raiders, who had probably dug a tunnel thinking they had found ordinary ruins and accidentally activated the security system. It would take time to clear the way, but most of the silver was still there. Most of it, the Viscount repeated, and his voice made Gerard's heart race. He eagerly began to convince his master that most of the silver was still there, and that the robbers could not have taken much. Of course, this was a lie, but it would take a long time to prove it. Gerard had already sent people to search for the thieves, and warned the gold and silver dealers, promising them a reward. He also had a backup plan. The silver was too heavy to carry away all at once, so the robbers would soon return for more, said the merchant. The Viscount finally stood up and, after a pause, ordered the robbers to be caught, without showing his true feelings in any way, as befits a pure-blooded nobleman. Gerard, who was already convinced that they had gotten off lightly this time, promised to skin the robbers alive, but no one had let him go yet. Instead, the Viscount reached for a box in the table, and that single movement made the merchant's blood run cold. Even though the situation had been cleared up, the guilty party still had to be punished, the Viscount said in an icy voice, gripping the whip tightly. Gerard clenched his teeth and resigned himself to his fate. Now he was entirely in the Viscount's hands. The whip whistled and struck his back with such force that the merchant almost bit his tongue. Only now did the Viscount allow his feelings to show. Showering the merchant with a torrent of insults along with the blows, he mercilessly whipped his back, and Gerard thanked God that they had not stripped him of his clothes before this flogging. Such blows easily turned the skin into a torn rag, and the merchant gritted his teeth and endured, because it was the only way to survive. The Viscount was furious that he had lost an entire squad of spies because of this, especially since it had taken so many years to train them, and he knew that the merchant was not on good terms with the captain. After a long day of work, the elderly Viscount paused to catch his breath. He doesn't care about petty quarrels, but if it affects others, that's a different matter. The Viscount growled and struck the negligent servant again. He ordered him to stop acting smart and ask for help if he needed it in the future. Gerard whimpered plaintively, his clothes torn to shreds, his back burning with hellish fire. The problem was that Gerard was going to give the money to Marquis Antonio, but then he remembered that he could collect old debts from a beautiful boy. The Viscount looked sternly at his servant and said that if the boy did not return the entire amount, they would cover the shortfall from the merchant's own assets by selling his guild. To each his own, thought Gerard when he heard this. But now he was ready to sell his own mother just to be let go, so he immediately agreed, biting his lip until it hurt so as not to swear, because he had earned his fortune himself. The Viscount returned to his chair and reminded Gerard that he had not yet forgiven him, and that he must find his silver. Otherwise, he knew what would happen to him if the jewels were not returned. And Gerard nodded obediently again, demonstrating his submissiveness with his pitiful appearance. He was treated like a dog. Even though he was not a nobleman, his wealth had opened many doors for him, and the merchant had managed to forget the true state of affairs. When Gerard left the office, he almost collapsed on the floor, and his servant immediately ran up to him. He handed him a potion, which the merchant could still afford. He then eagerly drank the contents of the healing vial, which instantly relieved the heat in his back. The servant covered his disfigured back, but the merchant ordered him to first smear it with the potion as well, and asked what was going on with Jacob. It turned out that he had been gotten rid of yesterday because he was useless. But there was another boy from the desert named Tar, with light hair and green eyes, very similar to Callias. Gerard clicked his tongue in dissatisfaction, as the boy from the desert had dark skin, and he didn't like those, but there wasn't much choice, so they had to hold out a little longer. It would take 3 more days to prepare their plan, but the pursuit would cause them problems, said the servant, adding that it would be difficult to escape in such a situation. There would be no better time, Gerard said. More than half of the Shadow Squad was dead or seriously wounded, and the rest were searching for non-existent looters. So now, everything had turned out perfectly, if in their situation, the merchant thought, considering the integrity of his carcass to be perfect, and a sigh of relief sounded in the carriage. Now they could go after the young count's money and stock up on more for a comfortable life on the run, the merchant grinned. But his servant was not sure that they would get the count's money so easily, because it was not for nothing that the boy had dealt with the question of his inheritance so quickly. A few days later, the sun was still shining brightly over Shaken Castle. Kraut burst into the room where the young Count and Viscount Russell were staying. He reported the arrival of Gerard Milkus, whom they had been waiting for. Callias was not surprised, and only grunted as he stretched out on the pile of papers on his desk. Russell ordered the knight to accompany the gentleman, but he did not go with them. The young Count had already proven that he possessed the abilities worthy of an heir, and the Viscount's presence would only undermine his authority. Kraut nodded understandingly. Callias could take care of himself. Gerard greeted him so smugly, as if he were already the owner of this castle, and it was he who was now receiving guests. "The Count looks even more handsome than last time," he said, and grinned. Callias gave him a haughty and contemptuous look, and told him to get down to business without unnecessary chatter. In doing so, he immediately showed the merchant that his place was in the market stall. But these words did not affect Gerard. He only grinned more broadly. After all, the foreclosure proceedings would begin very soon, and there was no way the county could repay such a debt, the insolent merchant said bluntly. It would be interesting to see him if the young count declared martial law and simply crushed the pathetic moneylender and burned the debt papers. Gerard had already set his sights on all the valuables he could take as collateral, and Kraut gave him a contemptuous look for it. "And if I refuse?" the young count asked coolly. The merchant rudely declared that he would assign some people to watch over the count so that he would not escape, although no sane nobleman would flee his estate and would rather hang the insolent commoner. Gerard took his finger out of his mouth and rudely pointed it at Callias, declaring that he would be under his complete control. Such behavior was in itself an insult to his honor, and the count had every right to execute the insolent man on the spot. It was no surprise that Kraut immediately grabbed his sword, wanting to cut the insolent worm in half. For some unknown reason, Gerard felt extremely comfortable and believed that he, a commoner, could collect debts from the heir to an ancient family. But the young count played along with the merchant and asked him if he could postpone the collection, since Gerard was such a master at dealing with debts. The latter smiled smugly, like a cat that had just eaten a mouse, and replied that there was a way. But for that, the count had to prove his sincerity. Kraut was still barely holding back from ending this ridiculous conversation. Callias reflected that the moneylender was asking for a bribe. He needed money urgently, so much so that he had come several days ahead of schedule. Sure enough, the count suddenly realized that it was about money. Gerard had already noticed the theft and was now rushing to make up for the loss. Then Callias told the scoundrel that he had the necessary amount in his hands, so they could do without sincerity. Gerard couldn't take it anymore and immediately jumped up, slamming his fist on the table and not believing his ears. "There is no reason to be surprised," replied the young count, "for this news should please the moneylender." And he laid out on the table before him bearer bonds issued by the Royal Chamber of Commerce. The merchant frowned. He had been counting on taking jewels and hard cash, and although paper is light, it is of little use when on the run. But on the other hand, he could flee with this colossal sum to another country right away. The merchant was quick-witted, and his pupils darted about like fleas. But that was not all. The count smiled triumphantly. Everything was going as well as it could. He placed a silver ingot in front of the merchant, just like the ones cast in secret mines. Callias offered to verify the authenticity of this silver as well, hinting that he had found 13 boxes, each containing 32 such bars. And then Gerard realized he was in trouble. The young count could reveal that he had stolen from the Viscount, and this could be perceived as a threat. How could a simple child pull off something like that? Gerard stared at the young count in amazement. If Viscount Servio found out about the theft of his silver, the merchant would not even have time to squeak. Callias, realizing this, continued to press, and warned that rumors might spread that someone had fled with illegal silver obtained by Viscount Servio on his lands. "There are only 2 chairs he can sit on," said the young count and pointed to them with a gesture. "You can reveal everything and be punished, or betray the Viscount," Callias concluded, his voice chilling the blood in their veins no less than Servio's presence. The count gave the cornered rat time to think. Now was the time to give him a little hope. He offered Gerard help in escaping and said that this was a rare opportunity that he should seize. Kraut involuntarily glanced at his master, sensing that he was plotting something strange. Simply escaping was not enough for Gerard. After all, it was better to die immediately than to live in poverty. Callias nodded in agreement. Everyone needs a foundation that no one can touch. Gerard realized that he must now serve him. The count spread his arms. Gerard had already become a servant of one of the most influential people in the country. The merchant said he needed even more powerful support than the Viscount had given him. Callias nodded again and handed him a paper to sign, because everything in the world has its price. It was a receipt for the full repayment of the debt. The bond had been presented to the royal family. Realizing Callias's plan, Gerard laughed with relief. Perhaps this plan would really work, he said, and agreed to sign. And he remembered for the future that it was better not to cross this man's path in the future. "Excellent," exclaimed the young count and smiled warmly. He was definitely not someone a merchant could deal with. When the ink on the paper dried, Gerard asked what he should do next. His path now lay to the capital, the young count informed him. There was no trace left of the merchant and moneylender's previous insolence and arrogance. Now he bowed to the count in farewell like a mangy dog. Kraut looked after him thoughtfully. "Let God foresee everything. But what would happen next?" he asked. "They need support," Callias replied. "And the most powerful man is the king's first son, Prince Gale. Until they do something, the prince's support is not something that simply comes and goes. They simply spent 60,000 gold coins profitably, receiving something more valuable in return," said Callias. But the dim-witted bodyguard only understood that the count's plans were beyond his comprehension. "It comes with time," Callias said indulgently, as they returned to the ancestral castle. Chamberlain burst into the Viscount's office with an urgent report. apparently in such a hurry that he threw on the first thing he could find, which turned out to be his Crusader grandfather's doublet. He reported that the entire management of the Milkus company had disappeared. The main assets were still on the balance sheet but were already being auctioned off, said the servant, and fell to his knees. Another servant, a Crusader in a long camisole, burst into the office with a report, saying that debt collectors had just broken into the Milkus company office and were causing a commotion there. But that's not all. Most of the shadow troops have fled, and even worse, some of the instructors working at the camp on the Gorda Plateau have disappeared. And today, a corpse was found, the servant added meaningfully, as if all the other troubles were not enough. Realizing that they were bearers of bad news, the servants tensed up and waited for the Viscount, who was phlegmatically leafing through a book, to respond. Then another man burst into the room, the captain of the Shadow Knights, and reported that all those who were dissatisfied with their situation had fled. Then the Viscount could not hold back any longer, and his fingers crumpled the pages of the book. He asked where they had last seen Gerard. "Shaken County," replied the captain of the Knights briefly, and everything fell into place. Last week, the Count's guards raided Gerard's group, locked them up in prison, and conducted an investigation, but it has already been confirmed that they are not there. The Viscount continued to boil with rage at this news. The captain pursued the fugitive to the very territory of Shaken County, but for obvious reasons did not dare to go further. Once again, Shaken Castle stood in their way, like a bone in their throat, thought the Viscount, and closed the book. Surely Gerard hadn't really decided to be stupid and run away from him. And then he laughed a chilling laugh and realized that the merchant had indeed done so. The Viscount first turned to Chamberlain, who flinched when he heard his name. He ordered him to go to the Gorda Plateau and inspect the safe and the silver in it. The sluggish man in the Crusader's costume was surprised, because according to the information he had, the mine had collapsed and was covered with sand. The Viscount pointed his finger at him and asked if they had run out of shovels, as he had to dig and find out if there was silver in the mine. Then he turned to the captain of the Shadow Knights and ordered him to recall the spy from Shaken County, lest he be exposed, and the scoundrel Gerard was most likely already far away from there. The captain nodded and asked if they should stop the pursuit altogether. The Viscount agreed, and said to keep an eye on the ships sailing down the River Arun, and if Gerard did not appear there in 2 weeks, he could return. Then he ordered Butler to get ready, and strode resolutely toward the exit, to go to a meeting with Marquis Antonio. He lived in a luxurious palace fit for a king, surrounded by picturesque lawns of trimmed greenery, which only the wealthiest people could afford to grow, and nothing more. The Marquis was surprised when he heard everything. Even perfectionists like the Viscount made mistakes. Servio replied without hesitation that only one pawn had escaped. The Marquis was a little younger than the Viscount, but unlike him, he had spread out at the sides and grown fat from a well-fed and lazy life. He spoke to him with the voice of a man who was bored with everything. "Things are not going so smoothly. Perhaps he was too hasty," said the Marquis. But Servio objected that they would have had no other opportunity to finish off Count Colin Shaken. If such a man supported the king, the balance of power would shift. The Marquis snorted. There was really no point in regretting it. The Viscount declared with icy determination that he would definitely catch the merchant who had run away with his money. But he did not know what the young count had in mind once he had helped him escape. Should they declare war and resolve everything by force? The Marquis asked him, and the Viscount frowned. It would be better to use diplomatic pressure, he suggested. This surprised the Marquis, as it seemed they had already done everything they could. The Shaken family had not yet replaced their representative in the House of Lords, said the Viscount. Orsil Tigrim was on their side, and they could take advantage of that until he was replaced, suggested the Viscount. This interested the Marquis, because avoiding war would reduce their expenses. However, neither of them suspected that Callias had already figured out their plans, that Servio would definitely not pressure them with military force, and that he already knew about Gerard's betrayal, which meant he also knew that the merchant had been helped to escape. Kraut also realized that they would be pressured diplomatically, and war would be left as a last resort, because it was expensive. But the knight did not understand how exactly they would do this. To manage the affairs of his estate, the owner must be on the ground, but he still needs a permanent representative in the capital to protect his interests before the king. That is why there is a House of Lords where agents are sent, said Kraut. And now the representative of this county is Orsil Tigrim, as the young lord had already discovered. And then it hit the knight like a bolt of lightning, because this man was one of Lady Stella's closest associates. This was a huge problem for them, and Kraut immediately became nervous and worried, surprised that his master took it all in stride. However, it was all part of his plan. He deliberately did not remove this man from office in order to leave the enemy with a clear path to victory. It was better to leave an obvious weakness than to spend a long time guessing where the enemy would strike. And when that happened, it would be easier to launch a surprise attack. The royal capital of Elisina was a huge metropolis by medieval standards, with 250,000 people and 5 centuries of continuous history. No walls could hold back the rapidly developing capital. The royal castle of the wise king, Clevio Clark, was the heart of this city. Gray and gloomy, it embodied the power gained and held by force. In the middle of the huge throne room sat the king, who gestured with his hand to begin the meeting. The king was already advanced in years and spoke in a weak voice, but he still carried himself with dignity. The first topic was the change of heir in the county of Shaken. King Clevio remembered the old Earl Colin and mourned his death. At the king's command, a representative of the county of Shaken stepped forward to answer for his lord. He was a middle-aged gentleman in an elegant suit, and he introduced himself as Orsel Tigrim. The king nodded wearily, tired from years of endless affairs of state. Orsel began by saying that there were currently problems in the county that were causing suffering among the common people. The king only frowned slightly. Every day someone suffered, so what? Orsel then reported that the first heir, Callias, had used military force to usurp power. He falsely accused the former wife of Count Colin of murder and imprisoned her, as well as sealing away his stepbrother's manacor. Marquis Antonio and Viscount Servio looked on with satisfaction at this move by the representative. The king must immediately understand that the young man is too hot-headed and needs to be pacified. Rumors had reached him that the young count was slightly unhinged, and the king asked for details. Orsel nodded. Everyone knew that the heir had wanted to kill himself. But the attempt had failed, and because of this experience, his mind had become clouded. But the old lion was not so simple. He was well aware that Count Colin had not died for no reason, but as a result of intrigue, for he was one of the few people the king could trust. The lands of the Shaken county were ruled by aristocrats from the family of Viscount Servio Kosherin, and Granbane had every chance of becoming the heir to 2 titles, so the king understood their interest in finally resolving the issue of inheritance. The lonely and young count managed to break his enemy's teeth. He is definitely not so simple, thought the king, and smiled slightly. It seems that the knights support him, since there is no more talk of rebellion, said the king, leaning his elbow on the throne. Or maybe they are following the orders of a madman, he asked Orsel. Orsel flinched, taken aback by the unexpected question, as the king usually showed no interest in the affairs of state. Then Marquis Antonio spoke up, stating that the main issue here was that the young count had sealed the core of another aristocrat's mana without due process. This meant that Callias had to be summoned to the capital to personally verify that he was mentally and physically healthy. This was what Marquis Antonio demanded loudly. The king understood that the Marquis was certainly not concerned about the honor of the nobles, but he agreed to this demand. However, he entrusted the investigation itself to the imperial department. The Marquis, who had returned to his place at the table, wanted to object, but the king did not allow it. If it upset them, said the king, they could send their own observer, and the Marquis could not argue with that. The conspirators met after the meeting, by the Marquis's carriage. From what had happened, they understood that the king clearly favored the son of a loyal man and was preparing his protege. Following the ancient principle of divide and rule, the king sought in every way to prevent the territories of Shakin and Kosherin counties from being united in the same hands, which were hostile to him. Servio was still determined. He did not see this as a big problem. The Marquis asked the Viscount what his plan was. To become the guardian of the country, that is, the king's father-in-law. Servio replied grimly. The Marquis grimaced at this. Giving his beloved daughter to a decrepit old man was an offer that filled him with anger. Servio realized that the time was not yet right for this card. He immediately clarified that he was not referring to the current king. May God grant him long life. But who knows? Maybe in 5 years everything will change, added the Viscount. Treason, the Marquis almost whispered. But he liked the idea. A new broom sweeps clean, and he would have a young wife, the daughter of Marquis Antonio. A few days later, the walls of Shaken Castle resounded with cries announcing the arrival of the royal decree. And what is in it? Asked the young count. Not at all surprised by the news, Thomas hesitated, not knowing how best to express himself. Callias leaned back in his chair and asked him to simply tell him the essence of the matter without any formalities. The count is ordered to report to the administration department as soon as possible and provide explanations regarding the suspicions surrounding him, Thomas said. And what are these suspicions? The young count asked indifferently. Their goal is to check how his suicide attempt has affected him, Thomas replied grimly. Callias laughed like a madman. The decrepit old man had decided that he had simply lost his mind and wanted to confirm it. Such nonsense is not even worth responding to. Callias told Russell and everyone else to ignore this verbal decree. Both knights were amazed at his boldness. Kraut asked in surprise if the Count could simply ignore the royal decree. Does he really have to ride to the capital at the first verbal instruction, even without a written order, so that pompous old men can test his sanity like a child? Asked Callias and snorted contemptuously. That is exactly what Viscount Servio expects of him, he noted and laughed. They just want to separate his head from his body and call it punitive psychiatry. Especially since Granbane, though broken, is still alive and can accept the title. The Count's loyal knights immediately expressed their desire to fight for him to the death if necessary. Angered by the enemy's insidious plans, Callias smiled contentedly. It was useful to have stupid but loyal servants, as they could always be relied upon and were not afraid of being stabbed in the back, which was priceless. He told the guys not to worry. Someone was already in the capital to fight for them with pen and paper. And the knights froze again with a surprised look. The Count smiled easily when they realized that this someone was the same bold merchant, Gerard. 2 weeks later, outraged that his instructions were being ignored, Marcus Antony appeared before the king. With him was the elderly wolf Servio, who always kept to himself and watched everyone closely. The king simply dismissed these claims, wondering what a young man who had not yet fully come of age could be plotting. The Marquis did not relent. Young or not, Callias had hastily sealed his stepbrother's fate and was now simply avoiding responsibility. A quiet whisper spread among the nobles and their representatives. "And what should the king do?" asked the king, playing along with the Marquis. It was an unprecedented honor for an aristocrat when His Majesty asked for advice. But it could also be a trap. The Marquis, looking pleased, announced that he would personally go to the county and check everything, and then present it in the best light. The king smiled and said he was glad that the Marquis had no other business and could do so. It was a very subtle political game, the essence of which few could grasp. Many were frightened by the ease with which the king could join forces with his political enemies. They dealt with this, and His Majesty ordered them to move on to the next issue requiring his attention. The steward froze as he read the next item. He was too surprised and hesitated. "The topic concerned the engagement of the 5th prince," announced the butler, and all conversation in the huge hall fell silent at once. Duke Ottomir was also surprised. Perhaps he had his own views on this engagement. The king remembered that the Marquis had a beautiful daughter, and suggested that she be given in marriage to the 5th prince. The Marquis was very pleased with this and replied that it was a great honor for them. Many understood that the king and the Marquis had formed an alliance before their very eyes. Duke Ottomir was the first to speak up, saying that it was customary to choose wives from among the queen's entourage or other noble families of the highest aristocracy in order to understand how a girl would behave in decent society. This was a serious statement, even though the prince was 5th in line to the throne, and the Marquis's title was 2 ranks lower than his title of duke. At the same time, Marquis Antonio, clearly flattered by the king's compliance, was extremely pleased with this. "Is the Marquis's daughter a simple country girl?" the king wondered, and the duke immediately began to mumble that he did not mean that. The king cut off all objections harshly and clearly, saying that only parents decide who to marry their children to, and no one else. His voice echoed off the walls of the hall. Even though he was old, he could still roar like a lion. The duke did not know what to say or how to justify himself. He himself could not understand what had incurred the king's wrath. The butler stared at the duke in surprise. Together with him, they supported the 1st prince, the first son from the first marriage. However, the 5th prince was the son of the current queen. Such favoritism could mean that the king had decided to make Ciel his successor and continue to rule while he was still young. But it looked as if the king himself had overturned his faction and possibly the entire table. Then the doors of the throne room opened and the heralds announced the arrival of the 1st prince. Young, energetic, with the springy gait of a fencer, dressed entirely in black with a gold cross on his chest. The prince looked impassive, and his pale face resembled a mask. He addressed the king directly and said he had something to say. The king immediately took offense, as he did not recall summoning the Dauphin. Therefore, he imperiously ordered him to leave immediately, as if he were throwing him out. The prince's coal-black eyes showed no resentment, and he continued to stand his ground. "Have you decided to defy the king?" His Majesty asked coldly. The prince steadfastly withstood the heavy gaze, and replied that he had no intention of doing so. The king raised his voice again and repeated his order to leave the hall and not interfere with Ciel's engagement. The prince again objected, saying that there had been a misunderstanding and that he had no intention of interfering in his brother's marriage. He had come across some important information by chance, but due to its significance, the matter could not be delayed. His Majesty and all the lords must be informed of it. The king listened to these words and ordered the prince to speak. In his hands appeared a letter from Russell Kneisel, who now ruled the Shaken estate as regent. The king was surprised that this surname had come up again, even though the matter seemed to have already been settled. Duke Ottomir immediately supported the prince and said that the Shaken's case was not yet clear. It was incomprehensible that even the messenger had not arrived with a response to the royal decree. And moreover, Marquis Antonio was the master of Viscount Servio. So there is a clear conflict of interest, because Callias sealed the core of the Koscherin family representative. The Marquis Antonio was greatly offended and growled, as if he were being accused of lying. But the Duke continued, saying that the interested parties should only act as intermediaries. Then the Marquis turned the same argument against Russell, saying that as a representative of the Shaken family, he could conspire with Callias. It was a compelling argument, and the Duke did not know how to refute it without weakening his own position. Therefore, he immediately invoked the authority of Russell Kinzel, who was the head of the Order of the Blue Lion and a noble master swordsman who would never compromise with injustice. He also held the Royal Medal of Honor and was a national hero. The prince nodded affirmatively, as if agreeing with the Duke, and they skillfully played their part, turning Shaken's intrigue to their advantage. It is difficult to accuse a national hero of lying, so the Marquis bit his lip in anger. Distrusting the most loyal knight is like distrusting the country itself, the Duke said. The king immediately defended the Marquis, saying that he could not have gone so far in his suspicions. The Marquis immediately agreed with the king, saying that he had not meant that at all. But in that case, there is no problem with reading the contents of the letter, said the prince, and again showed the scroll in his hand. The king could do nothing about it. If his courtiers wanted to intrigue against each other, let them do so in front of him, and he allowed the scroll to be read. The prince read aloud, and according to Russell, the assassination attempt was completely true. Moreover, Granben himself had sealed his own fate and admitted his guilt in order to mitigate his punishment. Marquis Antonio grimaced. Now the intrigue was turning against them, and this letter can be considered a report on the punishment of the criminals. All the knights unanimously supported this decision. The prince finished reading. Then another nobleman approached Prince Gale. He asked to see the signature. As a man who served with Russell in the knightly guard, he was well acquainted with the Viscount's handwriting, said the Marquis of Servigné. This tall, thin old man was widely known as the Sword of the Kingdom. He was proud of his skills, and Russell was one of the few whom the Marquis recognized. After checking, Servin confirmed that the signature was genuine, and Antonio made a big mistake by trying to question Russell's honor. Now the scales had finally tipped in the prince's favor. Marquis Antonio grimaced again. Initially, they wanted to weaken the royal faction and eliminate Count Colin, who was their leader. However, at the most inopportune moment for them, the Black Prince appeared. The new balance of power was already in place, with influence divided between the first prince and the fifth, and their struggle for the throne would soon begin, which meant that the Marquis had to deal with the county of Shaken as quickly as possible. He clenched his fists in anger and repeated that he did not dare to doubt the knight's honor, lest he receive a challenge to a duel from him. He continued by asking whether Granbane was involved in the assassination attempt, since they only had unreliable evidence from the murderer and still needed to conduct a second investigation. Duke Ottomir immediately interjected and declared that this did not mean that the title of Earl of Shaken could be left vacant. The Marquis replied that Callias was still 15 and could not receive the title of knight, and if you aspire to be an aristocrat, you must become no less than a master swordsman. Servinier nodded thoughtfully. It was the duty of an aristocrat to wage war, which meant being a knight. The Duke was indignant, asking how one could become a master at only 15. He did not forget to remind him that Marquis Antonio himself had only received this title after the age of 50. But the latter calmly replied that the head of the family must be a master. At the very least, Callias must rise to the level of a mana user and prove his potential.